Hey, Spatial Shark back with you for Unit 5's video on agriculture and rural land use patterns and processes. So here we are now past the halfway point in the AP Human Geography course. Unit 5 about farming, Unit 6 about cities, Unit 7 about industry and economic development. And, we're getting close to the end here. So for this next big unit, the geography of agriculture, you're going to have to classify economic activities by broad category. You have to know a little bit about the basic history of farming in the world. This will be a great head start for those of you who are ninth graders who will be taking AP World History next year. You need to understand, obviously, the vocabulary that goes along with all the agriculture. We're going to classify agricultural regions of the world by what they grow and by the type of climate that they have. And remember, latitude is a big part of climate. We're going to talk about a big model, von Thünen's locational analysis of farming. We're going to talk about all of the different agricultural revolutions, but particularly the Green Revolution, which is ongoing in the modern day. And we're going to talk about the successes in terms of increased crop yields, but we're also going to question, what has been the environmental consequence of farming this way. And of course, there's a big section where we're talking about the changing roles of women as agriculture has changed. Remember that for most of human history, women have been very heavily linked with our food. Think about mom, right? Mom's probably the one who is doing most of the grocery shopping, most of the cooking, most of the nutrition of the family depends on moms. So moms, thank you very much, because without you, we would probably all starve to death. But the reality is that the role of women are changing in the modern world of agriculture, all right? And women are getting more opportunities, more education, more jobs outside the home, which changes the dynamic of the food we eat and how we prepare it and how we consume it. Okay, so I told you about those classifying of economic activities. Here they are: primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary, quinary, right? Pretty simple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can take a second to pause here and you can read through these. I'm just going to go very quickly to save a little bit of time and tell you that primary activities are anything with extraction, right? Anything we're taking out of the earth or out of the water. Secondary, we're going to process it. We're going to manufacture it, take the raw material, do something with it. Tertiary is all about the services. So it's the selling, all right, and the human interactions. Quaternary is always about processing information, and there's an acronym that we always want to talk about called FIRE: finance, insurance, real estate, FIRE. Especially if you're dealing with OPM, other people's money, that's always going to be quaternary. And then quinary is going to be the decision-making jobs, right? The people at the highest echelon of the economy, right? Any kind of leadership, especially politics, but also executives, research, development, education at the college level and beyond. Okay. So why is this important? Because we can start to make predictions about a country's level of development in the global economy based on what people do as an occupation. They call it the occupational structure of the labor force. And we'll see that again in Unit 7. So this is a nice little preview here. But look at the countries of the world where agriculture is the biggest part of the economy. 2/3 of the US economy is service-based, right? We've moved beyond farming for the most part. 150 years ago, a lot of people in America were still farmers. Now we just go to, the grocery store, we go to the restaurant, the food just, there it goes. And most Americans don't consider and don't spend a lot of time thinking about how their food gets from the farm to their fork. But that's important that we are going to talk about that in this unit. But countries that are highlighted here in the darkest shading are countries where most people are engaged in agriculture. And those are countries that are going to be poorer. And I think the one that really jumps out at kids there is they see China and they say, "Ooh, I thought China was very rich now." Yes, part of China is, right? The area along the coastline, right? Shanghai, Beijing, Hong Kong, the big urban places in China are very well off and have moved beyond farming and industry. But now we need to remember that the rest of China, right? Because when we do a choropleth map at the national scale, right? The scale of analysis here, the data is being shown at the national scale, right? Remember our skills. We see that, the whole of China is still in that 60% and above category, even though parts of China would have a lot less farming, right? The United States is less than 2%. So then we start to look at that data more quantitatively, not so much geospatially, right? Remember, skill 3 is all about this, the graph. Skill 4 is where you have to pull it off of a map, right? And it's the source analysis. Well, here, this is just pretty much straight up quantitative data. And look at sub-Saharan Africa. But of course, we know that. We see it in the map, right? But now here it is just in a quantitative way. And we see that the developed economies, those within the EU, the European Union, that we learned about in Unit 4, all right, obviously the United States, places that are more developed, right? Even Latin America and the Middle East are fairly low in terms of farming. And again, you can see that here as well, okay? So make sure you know your patterns, but also make sure you know your processes, right? What are the factors economically, socially, culturally, politically, environmentally that make this possible, right? That reveal these patterns. Now, I said a preview of your world history class, right? Because as a 10th grader, you're going to take world history. Perhaps you took ACE International history, right? So I'm pretty sure you talked a little bit in world history about farming and about food, because population really doesn't grow until food production goes up, right? For most of human history, we were hunters and gatherers, right? Birth rates were very high, but death rates were very high too. And this goes back a little bit to Unit 2 when we were talking about population. And one thing I'm going to refer back to a lot is that more food always means more people, right? But then when you have more people, you need more food, right? And then more food always means more people. And remember, we had a good friend Malthus in Unit 2 who told us, oh my God, we're all going to die. There's too many people. There's not enough food, right? And so when we see this first agricultural revolution come along, they sometimes call it the Neolithic Revolution because it takes place during the New Stone Age. We see a shift from hunting and gathering to farming, and food production goes up. People have more food available. They become a little more sedentary, right? And population increases. And then in the second agricultural revolution, which kind of coincides with the time of industry, the beginnings of industry, the Industrial Revolution, and it's the application of this mechanization to farming practices, along with a new development called crop rotation, where the land could kind of regenerate itself and take a breather, right? Which all of increased yields. The one thing you need to remember about all of these agricultural revolutions, increased yields, right? If they ever ask you on an exam, right, there's more food, right? Because we're getting better at farming. And then the third agricultural revolution, which we're going to really focus in on, and there's one of the topics in the CED that is specific to the Green Revolution. And this is the one that starts about the 1960s, but it is even still ongoing today. And the big misconception kids have is they want to make that all about biotech. They think it's all about GMOs and it's all about, chemical farming. The reality is that the Green Revolution, the biggest shift is from subsistence to commercial. And we'll talk about those words in just a second. Okay. But new, right, in the Green Revolution. And again, more food always means more people. Okay. So just a quick schematic here that you can pause and you can take a look at. But it talks about the shift from hunting and gathering to planting our food, right? Raising animals, domesticating plants and animals, which of course, historically, very important in the development of agriculture. Okay. When we think about domestication of plants and animals, Carl Sauer, very famous American geographer, talked about the hearth areas of both plant and animal domestication. It's important to know this does not mean farming itself. It just means that people started to understand how they could manipulate and adapt the plants around them and the animals around them, right? To domesticate those usages so that it would benefit humanity, okay? Now, we have two different kinds of agricultural crops. Those that are root crops, they grow under the ground, and those are vegetative, right? They don't have seeds. And then there are the seed crops. Now, there's debate about things like tomatoes. Is it a fruit? Is it a vegetable? The reality is, by definition, if it has seeds, it's a fruit. And if it doesn't have seeds, it's vegetative, okay? So in that case, tomatoes would be a fruit. But the root crops are the ones that you break off a piece of it and stick it back in the ground, and it just vegetatively grows again. Potatoes and roots and tubers and manioc and cassava and yucca and sweet potatoes or yams and those kinds of things. Whereas the seed crops, you have to put the seeds back in the ground. And farmers for thousands of years have been saving the best seeds and reusing those to get bigger, better food, right? So we know that plant and animal domestication is kind of interchangeable in different parts of the world. but it just depends on where you are. If you're in Indonesia, if you're in the Middle East, if you're in South America, because we know that some of the earliest hearths of agriculture are also some of the earliest civilizations. And we need to be able to connect the civilizations of ancient history with the food that they were able to produce. So we talk about places like the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. Okay. And we could talk about Egypt with the Nile. We can talk about China, all right, with the Yellow River. We can talk about India, right? Modern day Pakistan, but the ancient Indian civilizations along the Indus River, right? And pretty much all of these river valleys were sources of high intensity sedentary farming practices that led to big populations because of all the access to food, right? And of course, here's a cool map that kind of shows you some of the places I was just talking about, right? And you can certainly see some of the places you probably remember from studying history, maybe in middle school, or maybe if you're one of my older kids, maybe you did this when you were in 10th grade, right? So this Neolithic revolution, what were some of the effects of it? Well, primarily, again, more food, right? But also the idea that people could start to urbanize. People could live in little villages at the time. We're not talking big cities like today. All right. The biggest cities of the ancient world might have been tens of thousands of people, whereas the biggest cities of today are tens of millions of people. Okay. But we start to see the social stratification, right? Where some people were still providing food for others, but that meant that others could specialize in jobs. Like construction or architecture, right? Certain people could make weapons. Certain people could, become government leaders. Certain people could be scribes or artisans, and we start to specialize, which gives us our social classes. Okay, and of course, more food always means more people. But then also, because you live closer together, disease spreads quicker through human populations. It doesn't take long for pandemics to start, right? And by the way, I know we're sensitive to this current pandemic, but don't forget, this is the most successful pandemic in human history. Less people have died in this pandemic than any previous pandemic. And the thing to remember would be that the next pandemic is probably going to be better than this one, right? Right. Because as humans, we're overcoming problems and we're learning. Okay. So also with famine, right? Famine was very real back in the day, because if you banked everything on this crop and that crop failed, everybody's going to be hungry. Whereas hunter gatherers, as long as they were following the animals around, they always knew they had something to eat. When you start farming and you start becoming sedentary, you hope that your crop is successful. Of course, today we're so good at farming that famine doesn't really happen unless it's man-made, usually because of conflict, right? You show me a place in the world where there's conflict, I'm going to show you people that are hungry, right? And hunger still exists in the world, but we're going to talk about how we're solving that. Remember, that's one of your big UN goals, is they want to end poverty, extreme poverty, multidimensional poverty, not just income poverty, but lack of food, lack of education, lack of medical care. And then, of course, as people fight over farmland, what are we always fighting about? We just learned this in Unit 4. Every conflict is about land. And certainly farming had a lot to do with that. So these early settlements, I already mentioned many of these places to you. We talked about social stratification. We talked about urbanization. We talked about the need for government. Well, again, this ties right back into Unit 4. Are you starting to see how much everything we do in this class links to each other, right? All of the units kind of compound and they relate. There's a common theme of patterns and processes that goes through it. And it's the where and the why there, right? You got to think like a geographer, right? So how will these things in agriculture relate back to population? How will they relate to culture? Food is a big part of culture. I don't know if you guys have ever done this at school. Well, in the pre-COVID days, we could have like parent nights or assembly nights or class parties where people would bring in a food from their culture and share, and everybody would learn about different foods in different parts of the world. And again, if you're Americans, we have a diet in our country that's been heavily influenced by immigration, right? If you remember back in the culture chapter, we talked about ketchup and sriracha and salsa, right? 3 red tomato based type sauces, right? That come to us because of immigration, because none of those 3 things started in America, right? So when we talk about government, right, the stratification of society was because of farming. Okay. And then we talked about, remember, root crops, which are vegetative. Well, here are the hearth areas that Carl Sauer identified around the world. And you can see the shaded areas where this kind of farming began: Southeast Asia, West Africa, and also the Andes region, the Andean part of South America. We took kids on a spring break trip to Peru, which was just an incredible opportunity. We saw how the Inca farmed, how they produced the food that was necessary for their civilization. When I went to Myanmar as a teacher a couple of years ago, a couple of summers ago, they showed us an area called Bagan, which was a very ancient part of what is today modern day Myanmar. I haven't had a chance to go to West Africa, but in Unit 5, your faculty lecturer is going to be a really good friend of mine. His name is Bill Mosley, and he teaches at Macalester College in Minnesota. He is literally world famous as a geographer, written several books, and he travels to West Africa every year to work with farmers in Burkina Faso, right? And helping them to increase their crop yields and helping them to improve the quality of their life, right, there in West Africa. And you can see, of course, that there's a secondary hearth area through the Middle East there. But let's change to the seed agriculture. And now you're going to see the river valleys, especially, that we talked about in China, right? The Huanghe, the Indus River Valley, that's the one shaded there between India, Pakistan. Also in East Africa, Ethiopia is a very, very famous ancient civilization, of course, going up the Nile. Remember, the Nile flows north. It dumps into the Mediterranean famously. We took kids to Egypt. There's over my shoulder there. Actually, Michael, that was the first trip we ever took him on. Katie was too little, but we took Michael with us. And, Michael loves to tell people about the time that it was 120 and he ate chocolate ice cream and then he vomited in the Nile because you probably shouldn't have dairy when it's that hot. But Michael got his little King Tut mass there while we were in Egypt. But if you come over to the Western Hemisphere, you can see up into now Mesoamerica. So we talk about our Mayans and our Aztec societies, right? And to some degree, you can find this in the United States as well. There was a very famous old Native American settlement called Cahokia, which is in modern day Illinois, right on that Illinois border around the Mississippi River area. Okay. So what are these modern agricultural revolutions, right? Second agricultural revolution, about 1750, the beginnings, really hitting its heyday in the early 1800s, using technology. We need to understand that there were also some legal issues, right? Because we had the Enclosure Acts. The British Parliament took the land that used to be common area, and everybody would kind of put their animals out there to graze, and people could grow their fruits and vegetables and things like that. Well, Parliament started enclosing that, and large landowners began to take over huge tracts of land. So what happened was a lot of people lost their jobs in farming, and a lot of poor started moving to the cities. This is the big time of urbanization. The early 1800s in Europe is a big urbanization time. And certainly that's when industry begins, jobs in the factories, people were looking for work. The population started to concentrate in cities. In Great Britain, they called these the black towns because they were burning coal in the factories. Health issues arose because of the death and the disease from working in the machinery. But what we see is that, again, more food, right? That's the time of Malthus, right about that second agricultural revolution. He could not have predicted how much more food was going to be produced, right? He couldn't see that. Remember, he said food is going to be linear. It's going to go in a line. And he said the population was like an exponential J-curve explosion. And what he was wrong about was how much technology would improve and increase the supply of food, right? Now, there are those neo-Malthusians who say, well, we're now at almost 8 billion people, right? How many people can we feed? And that's that neo-Malthusian argument. The cornucopian side is that, hey, technology will always allow us to overcome the limitations of the environment. And so then I'm going to tell you about a crop rotation system. I have an image to share with you in just a second about that. But the third agricultural revolution, again, I underlined it for you. The number one thing, they shifted from subsistence to commercial. And every agricultural revolution, you need to say higher yields. That's the intelligent way to say, we have more food, right? We have higher yields per acre, right? The farming can get more intensive. right? Because we have fertilizers for the land. And if you look under the green revolution, again, be careful. It's not just about the biotechnology, although that's the sexy part, but also irrigation, right? Even more complex machinery. We talk about hybrid seeds. Work was being done even in the early 1900s by a lot of the big universities of the United States out in the Midwest, your Indianas and your Michigans and your Illinois and your Minnesotas and your Nebraskas and Kansas, right? And Texas. And out in those states that were big agricultural states, the universities, the big land grant universities, all had laboratories where they were developing ways to make, bigger, better food for the people, for Americans. So it's not just the chemicals of today, although that's a big part of it, right? Fertilizer, pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, any kind of chemical additive that's going to make more food, right? That's a big part of it. So when we think about the crop rotation, the historical one is the 3-field system, where you would plant your cereal crop. In this case, we're looking at the top one there, which is corn. Okay. And you can tell corn because it's tall like a human being, right? Wheat is a lot shorter. When we say cereal crops, I mean, go to your pantry and pull out any kind of cereal. It's probably going to be wheat, corn, or rice. Those are the big cereal crops for humanity. And we'll talk about that. But in this case, corn. And once you grow your corn, then, you harvest it. So you cut it all down. And then what they would do is they would then let the field lay fallow. Okay. And they would let the field just rest. Right. And what they do is they would divide their field into these 3 pieces. So I'm going to grow my food on 1/3 of it. 1/3 of it's going to be fallow. And then 1/3 of it's going to be a cover crop. And what they mean by a cover crop is it could be something like mustard seed. It could be like alfalfa. It could be something that it's going to put nutrients back into the soil. And it could be animal feed as well, right? It could be clover. It could be anything that they're going to grow that is, going to put nutrients, especially nitrogen, back into the soil. And then the 3rd year, you go back and you plant your corn again, right? Because the soil has now recovered. So again, you do the cereal crop, you have the fallow, and then you have the cover. And at all times, you've got one of these 3 fields in rotation, okay? And that really helped to produce bigger, better food for more people. Now, today, we don't do that anymore. We don't need that 3-field system. Instead, we've got all of the chemicals, the fertilizers, the pesticide. We don't have to care about quality of the earth. We just put more chemicals into it, right? And we can have farms not measured anymore by the size of acres, right? And by the way, how big is an acre, right? An acre is about the size of the football field at your school, right? That's about an acre. So you could do, the 3-field system, right? And by the way, you'll sometimes see the measurement of a hectare, right? That's the metric measurement, but a hectare is like 3 acres, okay? Well, now we don't measure farms by acres. We measure farms in tens of thousands of acres. We now see farms that are in terms of square mileage, right? You go out to, the states that begin with the letter I, Indiana and Illinois and Iowa, and you're just driving along and you're just like, oh, wow, look at all that corn, right? Or you fly over the United States and you look down at all the states that look like rectangles on the ground and you just see all the wheat and the corn that's being grown out there. This is what they call monoculture or monocropping. Mono means one. This is all the same crop for as far as you can see. Okay. Now, and by the way, square mile, 640 acres in a square mile. Okay. Remember, square mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile, 1 mile. Fun fact, if you go over across the street from our school and you look at, Woodfield, right? That is, if you start at Publix and you go up to Clint Moore, that's 1 mile. And then if you turn left at Clint Moore and go out to the turnpike, that's 1 mile. And if you come down the turnpike back to Yamato Road, that's 1 mile. And then if you come back from the turnpike over to the Regency Square again, that's one square mile, right? 640 acres. Now, agribusiness has changed American farming big time. There was a farming crisis in America in the 1930s. A lot of mom and pop farmers, they lost their land because of the Depression. And there was the Dust Bowl out in the Midwest, and farming just really suffered. What happened was the number of farms decreased, but the actual output of farming increased, right? Because people lost their individual farms, but big companies could come in and buy up the land for cheap. And then they were able to make these massive big farms using the new technologies, and they could create more food, right, on increasingly smaller, more crops per acre, more crops, more bushels, right, for every input of labor, for every input of fuel, for every input of water, for every input of everything that made the farm go. More food was being created. Okay, so we now see that less than 2% of America is engaged in agriculture. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of food. It just means that there's tremendous amounts of food being produced by less and less and less and less people. Okay. So here's the question down at the bottom. How can there be hungry people in the world? We're producing so much food. It's not a question of production. It's a question of distribution. There's not an equitable distribution of the food. And even if the food were free, because I hear some of you, you're like, why don't we just give them more food? Yeah, that sounds great. But even if the food was free, it would cost something to get it to the hungry people. So the transportation of it is a problem as well. And then there are always the political aspects of it, right? It's hard to distribute food in a country where there's conflict going on. And we see in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, there have been conflicts going on. And that exacerbates the hunger issues. But the number one issue of hunger is not lack of food, it's poverty. If you could eradicate the poverty, you would eradicate a lot of the hunger problems. Remember, what's the number one UN goal by 2035? They want to eradicate poverty. And yes, they want to end hunger, and they want to increase education, and they want to, provide equity for girls and opportunities for women. We talked about that just a couple of weeks ago when we did the Gapminder Upgrade Your Worldview quiz. Okay. So, two big vocab words here: subsistence versus commercial agriculture. Subsistence is going to be growing food for you and your family, your kin, your little group, right? Whereas if it's commercial, the intention of the farming is to sell it to other people. Okay. Today's modern farming is commercialized, right? The farming of the poorest people in the world today is still subsistence. If you go to those places when I started the slideshow and you saw the places where, they were the poorest and their farming was, a lot of their people were farming, that's because it's subsistence farming. And so subsistence is always going to be intensive. If the farm size is small, it's very intensive. But if it's ranching or herding or something with animals, it's usually very extensive, like nomadic herding. They grow a lot of different foods, right? It's not like Americans where, a lot of American kids, they only eat like 5 things, right? People around the world eat a bewildering variety of fruits and vegetables that we don't. It's local consumption, like I said. It's privately owned land, right? They are the landowner, and they are also the farmer, and they are also the consumer, right? And the farming is mostly done without a lot of technology, mostly by women, right? Remember the changing role of women, because in the modern world, women are not farming as much, right? But in the traditional areas of the world, a lot of the farm work is still being done by women. Remember in the migration chapter, where are the men? The young men are often migrating to urban places looking for work or looking for educational opportunities, and then they might send remittances back to the village. Okay, you have to be able to answer these big picture questions, particularly on the essays. And of course, they don't purchase their inputs. If there's any water on their field, it's coming from the rain, or it's coming from water they might go get in a well, and they bring it and they distribute it onto their fields, right? If it's fertilizer, it's like animal dung. It's not going to be something where they got canisters full of chemical fertilizers and things like that. Their inputs are not purchased. And then, of course, the product is not sold, right? It's going to be eaten locally. Well, now look at the commercial side. Don't you just see that everything's kind of the opposite? So wouldn't this be a great compare, right, essay question? If you had to compare the types of farming, and what are the similarities and what are the differences? And you have to be able to talk about both, right? So again, take a second, you can pause and you can look through, right? Most of the things that you see on that commercial side, I've already talked about, right? But take a second and take a look at that. And then we move on to the next slide. All right. So then you saw the words intensive and extensive on that previous slide. So what does intensive mean? All right, it's not just about the farm size. You can have a huge farm and it could still be intensive. What they mean is the inputs per unit of land, whether we're using hectares or whether we're using acres or whatever measurement we're using. And it could be the labor, it could be the machinery, it could be money, it could be irrigation, so water. All right. If it's intensive, there's more inputs per unit of land. If it's extensive, the inputs are spread out all over. Okay. Now, I think we all know the output is what you get out of the farm, the produce, right? The actual food that we're going to eat, right? The inputs are what you put into the farm. Okay. So if you have a small plot of land and you have a very small, subsistence farmer who's growing a little bit of maize by the way, in corn, they're going to tell you, be prepared to see the word maize interchangeable with corn. And of course, in Espanol, maíz, right? So it's really great when you guys are multilingual, you learn a lot. Michigan's football team, please don't say that they wear yellow and blue. It's maize and blue, right? That's what they say. Ironically, I've got on my, old school Arsenal shirt that's yellow and blue, the classic, Arsenal alternate kit. When you think about large corporate farms in America today, right? Those are huge farms, right? And it's generally extensive. But if they start planting closer together and growing more food per acre, what they're doing is they're intensifying, right, the output of the farm. Okay. So extensive, again, marginal land usually. There's a really big one called shifting cultivation. We have a whole slide on that. Pastoralism, we have a whole slide on that. Today, this kind of farming is really disappearing in the world. It's hard to continue to farm extensively because there's so much urbanization, there's so much industrialization, transportation, disrupts their patterns, right? So most farming today, if it's subsistence, it's becoming intensified. And the number one intensively grown crop in the world is rice. We have a whole section on that, right? So be prepared to talk about the farming being either intensive or extensive. And don't forget, hey, my friend David Palmer has a whole section in here talking about intensive and extensive agricultural practices, right? I don't know. You never know. David might be on my YouTube channel once in a while. He might comment and make a comment. But ever since we've shifted to that David Palmer Blue Book, fantastic compared to the big textbook we used to use. Okay. So quick quiz time, right? We've got some ladies here in a village in sub-Saharan Africa, and they're threshing, right, their crop here. And they got the kind of mortar and pestle. And so what this is sesame seeds. And sesame is a big crop in this part of the world. And so they've got the husk, right, or the shaft, and they're going to pound it, and then they're going to collect the grain that comes off that, okay? And so when you see this is very intensive. You've got a lot of labor in a small little space, as opposed to something like this, and this is sheep ranching in New Zealand, right? When we took kids to Australia and New Zealand, both times we visited a sheep shearing kind of demonstration in New Zealand. This is where Lord of the Rings was filmed. We took kids to Hobbiton, all right, and had some great times there. But this is very extensive, right? This is very intensive. This is very extensive, right? This is very subsistence. This is very commercial. Okay? Now, Esther Boserup's thesis, she's kind of the antithesis of Malthus. Remember when Malthus told us that there wouldn't be enough food to be able to feed the growing population of the world? Well, Boserup has a critical argument against that, right? And she's saying that there is a demographic dividend of population, that with more people, there's new ideas, there's new innovations, new technology, there's more labor, right? And she says that people aren't going to voluntarily starve to death. They're going to work harder. They're going to become more intensive with their farming practices so that they can produce more food, and more food always means more people, right? So this Boserup thesis assumes, right, that people won't really move around. They'll just intensify their efforts to grow more food on their land. Now, of course, the only real thing that we've seen in recent decades is that there is a big rural to urban migration as people are giving up farming and are going to the cities hoping to find a better life. Now, again, this goes back to the push and pull factors that we talked about in Unit 2. right? But make sure you know who Boserup is. Make sure you know she's kind of the opposite of Malthusian theory. Malthus was kind of just saying, okay, there's going to be a geometric explosion of people, and that food just wouldn't be able to keep up. That so far has not been true. Now, when you look at the graph, right, Malthus predicts the linear, right? He predicted population would explode. We do think that population will level off. Remember, Hans told us that we've already had peak child. We're going to level off around 10, 11 billion people. So what happens is Boserup's kind of the blue line. Every time that food production, right, it's mostly linear, but every time there's a catastrophe, every time there's a famine, every time there's a pandemic, every time there's something that might be a crisis, Boserup says humans will find a way to increase their supply, to increase their productivity. And then it'll go along linearly again. And then there's another crisis, and they'll improve their techniques and their technologies, right? That's the Boserup thesis, that humans will always find a way to overcome the limitations of the environment. Very much a possibilist as opposed to environmental determinism. Okay, let's talk about some specific kinds of subsistence farming. Nomadic pastoralism, very extensive, different animals you can read through there. There's a specific kind of nomadic pastoralism called transhumance. You don't see this word very often, but you might run across it. This is where people are leading their animals, right, because of the change in the seasons. So that when it's in the summertime, they take them up in elevation, up into the mountains for the cooler weather. And then in the wintertime, when it's too cold up there, they bring them down into the valleys, and they have the grasslands that they can, graze on. That's a very specific kind of nomadic pastoralism. The big misconception that kids have, they think that nomadic people are just aimlessly wandering around like they don't know where they're going. These people have been doing this activity for tens of thousands of years in human history, that the grandparents teach the parents, and the parents teach the children, and then the children will teach the future generations. They know where to be at certain times of the year. They know where the water holes are going to be. They know where the pastures are going to be at certain times. And that's why in the Christian faith, the leader of the church is the pastor, because he's guiding the flock, right? It's pastoralism. It's the pasture, right, for the animals, right? That's where that word comes from. But again, nomads today are being pressured into more sedentary life because, like here in the Arabian Peninsula, you're trying to herd your camels or whatever, and we got roads, we've got, fences now, or walls that are being built to privately own the land. It's interrupting their cycles. Remember, this is a kind of cyclic movement, right? Because they're repeating this movement over and over and over again. Excuse me. A couple of years ago on the AP exam, there was a question about shifting cultivation. And the first part of the question said you had to describe the process. You had steps. And if you didn't do all three steps of the question, you couldn't get the credit. So what are the three steps of shifting cultivation? First, you have to clear the land. Now, this can be slash and burn, right? Which is sometimes referred to as Swidden farming, right? But milpa, there's no burning, right? So in shifting cultivation, you clear the land. That's step one. And then after you clear the land, you farm on it for a couple of years, maybe 2 or 3 years. Why only a short time? Because this is usually marginal land in the rainforests and the places of the world that are not great for farming anyway. This is the only way you can farm, right? So once the field is exhausted, and we're not talking big farms, right? We're talking maybe less than an acre, right? Very small. Once the farm is exhausted, then you move. And I don't say move like hundreds of miles. You move 30, 40 feet, down the earth, and you cut another little swath and you clear it all over again. You start the process all over again. And they might do this for 2 or 3 or 4 cycles. And then maybe 10 to 15 years later, after they've farmed in a little pattern, they'll come back to the original piece of land that has now grown back the grasses and the shrubs and the trees and things like that. There's more of a little canopy again. They cut that back down again, and they start all over again. And that's the process of shifting cultivation. So where do we do this? We do this a lot in the rainforest areas. where the climate's not really great for farming anyway. Obviously, they're going to grow a cereal crop. And in the case of Southeast Asia, it's oftentimes rice, right? If it's South America, it's typically maize or corn. And if it's in Africa, you'll see a lot of millet and sorghum, right? Millet and sorghum are two grain crops that are very common. If you go to some of the more fancy grocery stores and you buy the artisan grain bread, you might see millet and sorghum on the list of ingredients. Now, this kind of way of life is really declining because you have some ranching and logging going on after, especially in Brazil, where people have cut down little pieces of the rainforest, right? And then there's the people say, oh, this is deforestation. They're cutting down tiny pieces. And these people have been doing this for hundreds of years. And they don't just cut and then leave it cut down. It grows back. What's happening is that after they've cut a small section, the ranchers will move in and let their cows eat the grass that starts growing back first. And then you stop the process of growing back because the cows are eating the grass. So, and then you also have the loggers that are coming in and just deforesting huge sections of the forest. And it's killing the way of life for these very, very poor people who are farming this way for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is an example of what I mean by, the shifting cultivation. This one happens to be slash and burn. And by the way, when they do the burning, they use the ashes as their fertilizer, right? But again, it's not like the commercial fertilizers that you and I can go buy at the home improvement store, right? We've got all kinds of chemical fertilizers, Miracle Grow type things. Here, it's very, very, individualized, right? And the inputs are not purchased. Okay, sedentary rice farming. This is what we usually call wet rice. Unlike a lot of crops, rice will grow in the water, right? It has to be transplanted. The little seedlings will be put into the paddy, right? A rice field called a paddy. A lot of times this labor is done by hand. It's back-breaking labor. I've seen it firsthand when we were in Myanmar, right? When I told you about, going to Myanmar and seeing the farming. As we were way out in the rural parts of the country, we saw, usually 10, 15, 20 women at a time were out in the rice fields doing that work. We do grow rice in the United States. Now, be careful. When I tell you the United States is a big producer of rice, I get kids that go, we grow rice in Alaska. No, we don't. We grow rice where it's hot and wet. Guess what? That's the lower Mississippi River Delta, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Arkansas. That's where we produce rice, okay? But the 10 biggest rice producing countries of the world, just go to Asia, China, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, the Koreas. That's where you're going to see a lot of rice production in the world, okay? It is the most important staple crop. In fact, it's almost cultural. In fact, it is cultural to many of those societies. Rice is almost like a religious thing, okay? They'll eat it at every meal. When we've been in Southeast Asia on our trips, you'll get rice at breakfast, rice at lunch, rice at dinner. Okay. What can happen though in that climate, especially where it's a humid equatorial climate? You can double crop or even triple crop. You grow the crop 3 times a year. What does that mean? It means you're increasing your yield. Why are half the people in the world Asian? Remember that in population unit, we looked and we said there's more people in the circle than there are people out of that circle, because rice can support tens of millions and even billions of people in this region of the world. And this is why populations there are the highest. So make sure you know how they do that. Now, if it's very mountainous and steep, they terrace, right? What does terracing look like? They cut into the side of the mountain or into the hill. Now, I mentioned the transplanting into the paddy, right? And this is what they're doing here, right? They're putting the little rice seedlings. Now, behind them there, you see that's mature rice. That's rice that's ready to be harvested, right? What they're doing in the flooded portion there is they're putting the seedlings into the water, and the rice will get the nutrients out of the water, not really out of the soil, okay? Now, when we say terracing, this is what terracing looks like, right? And again, Southeast Asia is full of this kind. Now, people will say they worry about erosion. This is actually an anti-erosion technique. They're trying to keep the water, right, from flowing down the hillsides. But erosion has often been a problem for people in Asia because it is so rugged. The topography is so mountainous. But again, by using the terracing, they keep the water in the steps, right, of the side of the hill, and they're able to grow enough rice to feed their populations. Now, here's that rice production I was telling you about. Hot and wet, right? So look at China, look at India. Again, I mentioned all the countries there in East and Southeast Asia. Mongolia is too cold and too dry, right? That's why they don't really grow a lot. Obviously, Europe, not very popular. Wheat is much more common. Africa, there are some places that'll do rice a lot. Egypt, obviously, the Nile. Nigeria has the Niger River, right? There's a Niger River Delta that comes down through Nigeria. So you can see rice in West Africa. Brazil, especially along the Amazon basin. And then, of course, in the United States, please don't look at Alaska. Please remember what I told you about Arkansas and Louisiana, the lower Mississippi Valley. Now, the other place in America, if you see it, go out to California, go north of San Francisco. Now, San Francisco is historically, people know the story, it's very cold even in the summertime. But go right outside San Francisco, up into north of Oakland as you're going towards Sacramento, you'll get triple digits out there. It's 100 degrees during the daytime in the summer. And they can grow rice there in that part of Northern California as well. Okay. But this is rice in the United States. Now, smallholder crop and livestock, again, areas where you can't really grow rice, you can't really grow the other staple, cereal crops, and they call them a staple because they're the basic food. But we see a lot of animal livestock farming in parts of Asia, parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, right? I mentioned Mongolia. They can't really grow rice. They do a lot of animal husbandry, right? And they have the Bactrian camels, and they have, their different animals that they use for milk, right? And they make a yogurt and they ferment it and all that. So they're getting their calories in a different way, right? And from the animals, right? Now the animals become almost like a currency, right? In East Africa with cows, the Maasai herders that are in East Africa. Obviously, you could see llamas and alpacas in South America. There's all kinds of great examples of this around the world, right? But they will sometimes augment their animal husbandry with little bits of crops on the side, whatever they can scratch out, right, from the earth. This is very subsistence, right? It's very intensive on the farming side. It's extensive on the animal livestock side. Okay. And again, when we say animal husbandry, they're trying to, breed so that the best males and the best females are the ones that get the matings so that the animals are bigger and better and stronger and healthier and produce better milk and all those kinds of things. Okay. Now, excuse me. Now, what do they do with the animal waste? No part of the animal is wasted. So the animal dung in many cultures becomes fuel. Right now, this is in the plains of northern India, right, where you have a vast number of very, very poor people. Now you go to Mumbai and you go to Delhi and you go to the big cities, and you're going to find Indian people that are working in services and they're highly educated and they're making lots of money and they're driving nice cars. But remember, we see a big gap in every country of the world between the urban and the rural in terms of incomes, in terms of opportunities, education, those kinds of things, right? So what they're doing here is they're taking the animal waste product and they're fashioning it into these discs or plates, and then they dry it, and then that's used for fuel. They'll cook with it, right? They'll heat their homes with it, right? That's an example of how every part of the animal is used. Now, commercial agriculture, totally different now. Now we're going to sell it, right? It's not for our own private consumption. We're going to be, really a big global economy. Both developed, PED, and developing, PING, right? Countries can have forms of commercial agriculture, but it's different, right? And we're going to talk about that. And there are some political connections to that. So the core areas are the ones who dominate this kind of farming. The peripheral areas of the world are the ones who are growing most of the food that you and I are going to get in the grocery store, particularly when it's out of season. Because as rich people, we still want our fruits and vegetables no matter what time of year it is. So what we've discovered is that when it's too cold in the northern hemisphere, let's go to Chile, right? Let's go to places in the southern hemisphere Peru and Ecuador, and we can get our fruits and vegetables from there and fly it into the United States, right? Because it needs to get here quick, so it's still fresh. And so when you walk through the grocery store in the wintertime and you pick up your lemons and you pick up your, peaches and you pick up your, strawberries and things like that, it may not be from the United States. Okay. So this is all leading us to what we call commodity chains, right? And this is where agribusiness comes in. You look at McDonald's. McDonald's is not only the biggest buyer of beef in America, they're the biggest buyer of tomatoes. They're the biggest buyer of potatoes. They're the biggest buyer of cheese, the biggest buyer of eggs. It's this massive chain that goes from the producer to the consumer, and it's all of the logistics in between. It's the processing of the food, right? The mechanization of it, the manufacture of it, from the raw material to what you see, when you go into the restaurant or you go into the grocery store and you prepare it for yourself at home. They now even talk about, I know in David Palmer's book, he talks about cool chains where you have to keep things cold, right? Refrigeration. Well, we can do that in today's modern world, right? And so this nutrition transition is occurring, right? In rich countries, most of our nutrients are coming from diets that are rich in milk and meat and cheese and, the denser calorie things. And this is why we become fatty boombaladdies, because, the rest of the world, their nutrients are coming from a very lean-based diet, a lot of plant-based protein. They don't eat meat. Meat is always an indicator of wealth. And think about most Americans, we eat meat multiple times a day, unless, of course, you're really well off enough that you can choose to be vegan or vegetarian, right? The people in the world that don't eat a lot of meat, they're not choosing to be vegan. That's just all that they can grow for themselves, and that's all that they can afford. So most food in a commercial agricultural system is driven by consumer demand. What does the consumer want? What will the consumer pay for, right? And when you think about the growth of places like Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and those kinds of places, it's expensive, right? I mean, that's the joke about Whole Foods. You got to spend your whole paycheck, right? But hey, you go there and there's a lot of sexy people buying a lot of organic foods, right? Much different than people at low income levels who can't even dream of organically produced foods. Okay, here's a great example of a commodity chain for a product that a lot of teenage kids love, and that's Nutella. Nutella always seems to be popular on one of our spring break trips, right? The kids at breakfast, they always want to spread their Nutella on everything. Nutella, the main ingredient is hazelnuts, right? Obviously the chocolate. And then, of course, there's the oils that they put in it, right? Now, I don't know if you guys know this, but palm oil is huge in Southeast Asia. Big production of palm oil. When you see the hazelnut, Turkey is the biggest producer of hazelnuts in the world. So if you're Nutella, you better find your hazelnuts. And they've had some problems in the last couple of years with the production of Nutella. Most of the cocoa comes from West Africa, right? Cacao is the basic plant to make the cocoa. Brazil's a huge producer of sugar. But notice that where they grow the raw materials and then the triangle, which is where they make the Nutella, they got to ship all that stuff in. This is a global supply chain. It's a global commodity chain. And if you see, the headquarters of the company there in Italy, right? And then you see the sales offices in big cities of the world like New York and Tokyo, right? And Mumbai, right? And in Johannesburg. But yet the actual farming is being done in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Turkey, in Malaysia, in China, right? Not the wealthiest places in the world. And they're shipping all that raw material to the factories that are mostly in Europe, in North America, in South America, Argentina, Brazil, much bigger economies, Australia, those kinds of places. And then they're going to ship that to consumers and grocery stores all over the world. That's a global value chain, right? That's a commodity chain. And you could do this with potatoes to make French fries or potato chips. You could do this with Coca-Cola. You could do this with any food product. You could go back and research the commodity chain. Okay. You can do it with coffee. By the way, products in the world today, bananas, we got problems with bananas. I'll tell you about it in a minute. We got problems with vanilla in the world, right? Madagascar is the biggest producer of vanilla in the world. But that's not where Nutella gets theirs. They get theirs out of China. And the vanilla crop in Madagascar has been hit hard. Climate change is affecting it. There are pests that get into it, and disease that gets into the crop. So make sure you know about commodity chains, right? When you go forward linkages in a commodity chain, you're getting closer to the consumer. When you have backwards linkages, you're getting closer to the producer, right? And between the producer and the consumer, there's all these other steps involved. Okay. Von Thünen, we're going to hit him really hard here, right? I'll let you read the background here, but then I'll go into the next part of the slide and I'll start telling you about the different rings and the bid rent theory and all of the things that come with Von Thünian patterns. This is huge in this unit, right? So be ready for this next part. Go ahead and reread or pre-read, and then I'll see you on the next slide. Okay, so Johann Heinrich von Thünen, 1826, living in Germany, southern Germany to be precise. And he wanted to he asked this question: why do farmers decide to grow what they grow, right? How do they come to that choice? And he figured geography had something to do with it. He's right. And so he basically looked at the bid rent for the land. How much does the land cost? And then how much will it cost to get your produce, whatever it is you're growing, how much will it cost to get that to the market, right? Or to the city, the town. In those days, almost all produce was bought fresh. It's 1826. There's no freezers, right? There's no preservatives and those kinds of things. It's all bought fresh and consumed locally. So how would farmers figure out what they could grow? Okay, so he assumes that the farmer is going to grow something that's going to make enough money that they can pay the rent for the land. Okay. I mean, if you grow something that's worth less than the land, you're going to lose your farm, right? So the farmer has to make a decision. What can I grow that's going to make enough money to pay the rent? And then two, I have to be able to get that product to the market without it going bad. If it spoils, nobody's going to buy it. So if I live closer to the market, I can grow something more perishable. If I live farther from the market, I better figure out how to grow something else that's more durable, that doesn't go bad, so that the trip to the market, it can withstand the shipment. Now remember, again, it's 1826. We don't have these big trucks on the highway. We don't have trains. We don't have airplanes. We don't have those things. How was the farmer getting the goods to the market? They had an ox cart with 2 oxen. I mean, this was his assumption. And the farmer was on the little wagon, and there you go, off to the little town on the weekend to sell your little produce. Okay. Now we still have these kinds of farmers markets in big cities. But again, these are young, sexy people on skateboards, right? That go to, elite colleges, and they're out there getting local honey, and they're getting their little, fruits and vegetables that have been produced, there on the local farms. Okay. It's not the kind of big commercial farming we see today. But one thing about commercial farming that's important, Von Thünen absolutely depended on the idea of commercial agriculture, because his basic assumption is the farmer is going to sell the food. So where will Von Thünen never work? It's not going to work in a subsistence agricultural economy. Okay. It's got to be in a place where you have commercial agriculture. The crops that are grown closer to the market, those are more intensive. You have to grow more food on less land to be able to make enough money. The crops that are grown far enough away can be extensive. You can have more land, right? And less crops per acre because you don't have to pay as much. This is what we call bid rent theory, which I'll talk about in just a second. So now these farmers markets we talked about, here's a good example where, again, you see all kinds of, locally produced fruits and vegetables and those kinds of things. Here's that bid rent curve I was telling you about. Bid rent, think about monopoly. As you go around the board, the price of the properties gets more expensive, right? Starting with Baltic and Mediterranean and ending with Park Place and Boardwalk, right? You go around and it gets more expensive. The same thing with land. Land is more expensive closer to the city, and it's cheaper farther away from the city. This is really a Toblerism. Remember Tobler? Everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. So every time they go in and out of the garage, it just vibrates the whole house. So when you think about the land expensive, the actual dirt itself, okay? So closer to the city, land more expensive. Farther from the city, land less expensive. This is why you have huge houses in Boca Raton, far away from the water. When you're like our part of the world, the water becomes the peak land value intersection. They call that PLVI, right? So you go closer to the beach, prices go up. Out by 441, which by the way used to be farming areas, the houses there are enormously big because the dirt is cheap. So I can build a bigger, better house, right, on cheaper land. If I go back towards the urban part over by US 1, the land becomes more expensive. So the houses get smaller unless you're on the beach. And then we're talking tens of millions of dollars, right? But the reality is this bid rent curve is true for any place in the world, right? The land that's more valuable will be more intensive. The land that's more, cheaper land, extensive, right, can be doing things like, animal ranching and those kinds of things, right? So make sure you know how the rent paying ability and how the distance works. So what does von Thünen assume? Well, he assumes that the market is in the middle, right? So he has a set of rings. We sometimes call him the Lord of the Rings, right? If you want to remember him that way. The market is self-sufficient. So in other words, I'm not going to go to another town to buy produce. I'm only going to buy in my little town. There's no external influences. Now, Germany at that time was not yet unified as a state. It was actually a lot of small little states, and therefore his model could work there in 1826. Today, you have to make some other assumptions, but he calls this isotropic, flat and featureless, right? Like a board, right? Flat. There's no physical interruption. So you could make your rings, right? And they wouldn't be interrupted. The soil quality and the climate are consistent throughout. Everybody has equal purchasing power, all these assumptions. Why do we have to make so many assumptions? Well, do an experiment in a science class. You can't have like 16 different variables, right? You have to keep everything constant so that you can measure what you're measuring. And what he's measuring is how much does the distance cost in terms of transportation, right? Everything else had to be equal, right? You couldn't say, I'm growing this crop because this land is better or worse. That blows up his model, right? The only thing was how much does it cost to transport in terms of perishability and all that. And obviously, how much am I going to get for my product so that I can pay the rent on my land, okay? And he says farmers will always act to maximize their profits. The greater the distance, the greater it's going to cost. Okay, look at this, right? Here's the bid rent curve, and it's the same thing now, except we put it on von Thünen's world, right? The land that's closer to the market town is going to be more dollars per acre, right? And farther away, the land's going to be cheaper. So what will we do different? Okay, inside the town would be the things that perish fastest. Things like, little vegetative and little fruit crops that are super perishable. Dairy, oh my God, because in 1826, there's no refrigeration. So anything that was really perishable was inside that little ring. And then there would be a forest belt, because in those days they burned wood for fuel. And then you go outside the forest belt and you would get the grains, the cereal crops, the wheats and the barleys and the rye, because it's not rice, because this wasn't in Asia, it was in Europe. Right? It wasn't a lot of corn, because corn was Western Hemisphere. I don't know if you've ever looked at a map of the world. Like rice is always Asia, corn is always in Western Hemisphere, and wheat is always kind of right down the middle there. When you see that, the grains and the livestock, they could be farther away. Livestock, think about the word. How were the animals transported? They were still alive. You didn't kill them until they got to the market town. And then you slaughtered, the cows and the pigs and the chickens, and the people bought the meat fresh, and they produced it right then and there. Now today, this is totally different, right? We got big slaughterhouses out in the West. Nebraska's got a big one. South Dakota, meat packing plants, and they kill the animals, right? And then they package the meat, right? And they wrap it in the plastic wrap, and they freeze it. And then you go to Costco and you get like huge steaks, It's different than von Thünen's world, right? Our milk today, we have dairies still, but they're not super close to us. In the olden days, the dairy would be the farmer who lived like a mile from you. They would milk their cow every morning and drop a little glass milk jar outside your house. Today, there's a dairy in Lakeland for Publix, and they produce hundreds and thousands of gallons of milk a week. And then they put them all over every Publix in Florida, and you go in and buy 2-3 gallons at a time if you're like my family, because the milk is always gone. Is there any milk in the refrigerator in the garage? Right? But this is the von Thünen pattern that you need to be able to recognize. Okay, we'll talk about this in class. There's a whole topic on this. Okay, I love to show this. And since I probably won't have time in class, I wanted to put it in here now. Can we see von Thünen in the United States today? Now, von Thünen was 1826 Germany, and lots of things have changed. Transportation, highways, railways, refrigerated trucks, pasteurization of the milk, vacuum sealing packages and jars and all kinds of things like that. But let's take a look at the United States. What's New Jersey's nickname on their license? It's the Garden State. Oh my God. You mean market gardening of little fruits and vegetables? Okay. And then you've got a dairy belt. And you go into upstate New York and you got Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And you got all kinds of cheese farms and things like that. Right. And Vermont is famous for that. And upstate Chobani yogurt started in upstate New York. And then you kind of go a little bit further and you get to the Appalachians, where there were a lot of mountains and forests and things like that. And then there was the cotton and tobacco, which were kind of cash crops. They weren't really food crops, but they were big in that area of the mountainous and the forested parts of the Midwest. But go a little further west and you get to the corn and the soybeans in, Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin, right? And even further south, you could see some rice crops, right? The wheat belt up and down the Great Plains, okay? And then you got the animals out there in the far west, okay? Well, look at the rings. It looks a lot like von Thünen patterns if you assume that New York is your one market, that everything's going back to the East Coast. In reality, if you change scale and you did the same thing with Florida and Miami was your one market, you could find dairy. There's a road down in Miami called Ives Dairy Road. There used to be a big market, a big dairy there. It's not. Now it's, a bunch of houses. And, you could see all the fruits and vegetables in Broward and Palm Beach County up and down 441, right? And then you could go to Kissimmee and you find all the cows, like when you're driving to Disney and you see all the cows on the other side of the turnpike. You could do these patterns everywhere. You could do it off Chicago, right? Again, your dairy would be the people in Wisconsin that wear cheese on their heads at football games. You could do these patterns all over the United States. You could do it from Los Angeles working back the other way. I think a lot of Americans don't know that California has that Imperial Valley and that area, just outside of Los Angeles, where you get a huge amount of fruits and vegetables. And in today's world, with the packaging and the refrigeration, 50% of the fruits and vegetables in the United States today that are consumed are grown in California. So you could do these von Thünen patterns all over the United States. Okay, real quick, let's talk about the third agricultural revolution. This is the one that we sometimes call the Green Revolution. And again, don't think of it as just being biotech, right? Think of it as a lot more than that, sooner than that, before that, because biotech really has only come about in the last 25, 35 years, right? But it's a shift from subsistence to commercial. The biggest impact in the world has not been in rich countries. We already grew a lot of food, right? Africa hasn't really been able to benefit because, and it's not just money. Everybody defaults and says, oh, it's because they're poor. Well, Latin America was poor. India was poor. China was poor. They've had tremendous success with the Green Revolution, growing more food. The reason why Africa really didn't benefit was because wheat, corn, and rice are the three big crops that the Green Revolution has targeted to increase yields. Well, Africa didn't grow a lot of wheat, corn, and rice. Africa grew things like millet and sorghum and yams, which we call sweet potatoes, right? They grew a thing called cassava, which in Latin America, we call that yuca, right? A mí no me gusta yuca porque yuca no tiene color y no tiene sabor, right? I'm not a big fan of yuca. There's no real taste. There's no real flavor, right? Unless you cover it with like onions and garlic and, and that, okay, I'll eat that with black beans and rice and with the masitas de puerco or something like that. But when you think about African food, they didn't grow wheat, corn, and rice. So they kind of missed out on all the research and development and the money that got put into this kind of technology, right? And by the way, how did the manioc and the cassava and the underground roots and tubers, how did that get to the Caribbean? Oh, the African slave trade, right? Because when we brought Africans over on the slave ships, they had the little foodstuffs that they were able to sneak on board, and they started planting those things in the New World. A lot of fruits and vegetables and foods in the New World came because of that triangular trade, right? Which was part of that Columbian exchange from the Western Europeans to the United States through Africa as well. Okay. So again, why do we still have hunger in the world if we can produce so much food? Again, it's because of the distribution of the technology. Okay. Now, what does the green revolution require? Lots of water, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, all kinds of chemicals, using a lot of oil. That takes a lot of money. Okay. Recently, big companies have gotten involved. Monsanto is one of the biggest ones in the world. If you want to look up Monsanto, they're based in St. Louis, Missouri. But developing all kinds of things that kill weeds, that kill bugs, that kill plant diseases, right? That make the food more sensitive or less sensitive to light and water. We can grow foods in drought conditions. We can grow foods with less light. We can grow foods with cooler temperatures. There's all kinds of things now that we can do, right? Because of the biotechnology. And we have a big biotech academy at our school. Some of you might be in that, right? You could probably come in school and tell us about how we're growing bigger, better, faster food. Okay. And then you look at the reaction to the green revolution. There are those people who say, ooh, I don't want all that technology in my food. I prefer unadulterated, simple food, traditional food, without artificial ingredients, without all the technology. And there is an organic niche. And I say niche because it's small. Not many Americans buy organic food. And the real answer, because they might ask you this, what's the single biggest limitation to organic food? It costs a lot. Most people can't afford it or choose not to pay for it, right? But you see organic is an option. And the Greenwise, Publix markets, and like I said, Whole Foods and Trader Joe's and Fresh Market. And I don't want to leave anybody out, but those kinds of places. Or I can go to Bednar's or the Boys, and I can go get it. It's just been picked. All right. And in some parts of the United States, I can join a community supported agriculture group, and I can buy in for the right to go help the farmer. And then in return, I get a couple of boxes of fresh produce 2 or 3 times a year. Right. And that's community supported agriculture. So there's all kinds of ways that this can happen. Right. This new green revolution. But again, think of where in the world it's been successful. So look, from the 60s to the early 2000s, Africa's just pretty much straight line. But look at South Asia, that's India. Look at East Asia, that's China, right? Latin America would similarly be increasing dramatically. Africa kind of flatline there. They just didn't have the kind of food that the Green Revolution was targeting, right? And if I'm a company and I'm going to invest lots of millions and billions of dollars into research, I'm not going to pick a crop like millet, which very few people eat. I'm not going to pick a crop like cassava that not a lot of people eat. I'm going to pick rice. I mean, rice was the number one crop in the world that the Green Revolution targeted. And then, of course, wheat and corn and things like that. But that's why you see Asia, explosions of yields, and more food always means more people. Okay. Now, what about the organic movement? So here's the biotech. Obviously, the United States is really high on that, right? Brazil has a lot of biotech as well, right? Sorry, when we say organic, biotech would be the artificial, right? The chemical, the GMOs, the genetically modified organisms, where they're changing the DNA. Not just, they're doing it in the laboratory. They're changing the gene sequencing of the food. And of course, the United States can do that because we have big corporations that do that. Brazil has been doing that, especially with their sugar. But notice that Europe is not. Notice that Japan is not. Japan generally avoids anything that's, changing the nature of DNA. Europe is mostly against it. The EU has a lot of policies against biotechnology and about genetically altering the ingredients of the food. So mostly it's American companies and the big agribusiness corporations that have been doing this. Okay, and again, you would hope that in countries where food is scarce and where hunger is still prevalent, like India, you see that they are accepting some of this biotech ingredient. And they know that they can produce more food with that. So you see India is a little shaded there. China's a little shaded there. Most of Africa is not, except for South Africa. You do see a little bit of shading down there as well, right? Brazil, Argentina, really embracing that biotechnology, right? Now, the organic, if we did an organic map, it would almost be the flip of this, right? Europe has a lot of organic farming. Almost all farming in poor countries is organic, not because they're choosing to be organic, but because they cannot do the green revolution because of the cost and the technology and all that. So if I go out to some super poor country and I'm really out in the rural woods and I'm eating food, it's probably organically produced because they didn't go and buy fertilizer. They didn't have chemicals. They didn't have all of those things. Okay. It's important to know that. Excuse me. So speaking of India, India, of all the countries in the world that are developing economically, India has been one of the ones that has embraced biotechnology and the scientific adaptation of the food the most in Asia. Brazil, big in Latin America. So if they ask you, where has the Green Revolution had the biggest impacts? Latin America and Asia, okay? Not in Africa and not in the richest countries of the world because we already had tremendously high food yields. Okay, so you can read through this. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time. These are some of the things. If you've ever been to Epcot and you did the ride where you go around and you see all the farming, here it is, right? Disney wanted to showcase all of the new technologies in farming. I'll give you a second to read. Now, when we think about from the air, what will modern farming look like? Okay. This is what you'll see if you fly over most of the United States, especially the western parts of the United States where it gets dry, okay? Arid conditions. So from the air, when you look down, you see these circles. This is called center pivot irrigation. There's a pump right in the middle of each of these fields. And then there's an arm of these big sprinklers. They're huge, right? 10 feet tall with huge wheels on them. And they go around and around and around and around and around. And that's why you get the dark colors like this, right? The darker the green, the wetter it is, the lighter it's, obviously dry. Now, what most people don't realize, how big are those, okay? If you start, and I'll use my cursor here, start here and come down to this point here, and then go down to here, and then go over to here, and then come back up, that's 1 square mile. Okay, so every 4 circles you see here is a square mile. So this might be one farm. Every one of those circles is not a different person's farm, right? You can see the town might be over here, and you see there's a little isolated buildings here and there and here and there, right? Each farmer might have a square mile, which would be 640 acres. Or each farmer might have 2 or 3 of these square miles, which would make their farm into the thousands of acres. There are farms in the United States that are measured in tens of thousands of acres. Okay. But this is the kind of modern day commercial farming, right? Using technology, using machinery, using irrigation to increase crop yields. And this is not subsistence. This is commercial. And it's oftentimes monoculture. It's one thing. It's either corn or it's wheat, right? Or it's, some product, but generally corn and wheat or soybeans, right? The number one crop in America is corn, maize. Soybeans are number 2, right? Wheat is not in the top 2. Wheat falls further down the list. And if you say, oh, Mr. Turner, soybeans, I don't eat soybeans. Yes, you do. You go into your kitchen and I don't know, maybe help mom. This would be a great way to play this. Mom, can I help you the next time you go to the grocery store? She thinks you're just being a nice kid. What are you doing? You're thinking like a geographer. Start looking at all the products in the store and start looking at how many corn and soy ingredients you find on the ingredient list, right? You'll be amazed how much of your food is made up of corn and soy products, soybean products. Okay. What are the limitations of the Green Revolution? Again, I'll let you read through this. We have a whole slide in class that we're going to do that is about the Green Revolution. So I don't need to talk about that too much in this video. I can save myself a couple of minutes and you can hopefully not spend 2 hours watching a video. But what are some of the technical and resource limitations of the Green Revolution? Okay, so what are some of the implications environmentally? The wild diversity of food in the world is being reduced, right? Because with technology, we've only reproduced the best varieties of plants, and we've lost a lot of the natural, right, diversity of fruits and vegetables. And the only problem with this is, what if a disease breaks out in these few varieties of, say, lettuces or corns or tomatoes, right? And then you've got a big problem that technology will have to solve, because technology created this problem as well. Okay. So the wide variety of foods is being reduced, right? Biodiversity is being affected by this. Now, I mentioned bananas earlier. The banana that I ate as a very young person, right, before kindergarten, let's say, that banana went extinct, right? It literally, they had a problem. There was a disease that attacked it. And they said, okay, we got to get rid of this banana because we can't continue to grow it. It won't work. So they started cultivating a new variety of banana. The banana that you guys eat is not the banana that existed in the world when I was in it. Now, we're not talking about the bananas that grow on your tree in your backyard. Those are natural bananas. Those are wild bananas. Those are not the ones that you go to Publix and hey, look at this. I picked up a pound and a half of bananas, right? So we have big companies like Dole and Chiquita, right? And these are the big corporations that control the banana commodity chain of the world, right? And it's not just in your banana that you peel, right? It's in all the products that end up having banana in them, okay? The banana puddings and the banana flavorings and all that. So there's a big commodity chain for bananas. Well, when this banana went extinct, they had to come up with a new variety, and they did. But now, if you go Google search this, there's a new problem in the banana crop of the world, and they're not so sure that the banana that you're eating today will survive. We may end up having to go to a new kind of banana. And there's also a problem with coffee, and there has been problems recently with chocolate and vanilla, and a lot of these commodity products that are huge in the world are being affected by the reduced biodiversity, because when there's more biodiversity, the crop can survive, right? The environmental change is better. Okay. So when technology reduces biodiversity, technology is going to have to be vigilant to solve the problems that may arise as a result. Then there's the social issues. And again, we talked about Hans Rosling earlier this year. And remember, Hans already said, people used to say, oh, there's going to be more food and that'll be more people and overpopulation, all that. The reality is we can produce way more food than we need to. It's not a question of production. It's a question of money, and it's a question of distribution. But these social issues now revolve around politics. They revolve around money. They revolve around political views about climate change. They revolve around decisions of how we eat. Look at the very bottom. Should we be locavores? Most Americans, your food goes 1,500 miles before it gets to you. So what are you also paying for? You're not just paying for the food, you're paying for the transportation. And what is the true cost of the food? It's not just the cost of the food item, it's the cost of the fuel that it took to get the food all the way from where it was produced to where you are. This is why, and I think you guys are young and, we live in Boca. You go to these restaurants that are like farm to table kind of restaurants where everything is locally produced. And you look at the menu and they say, oh, this was grown locally. This came from, West Boca. This came from, the farm. By the way, there's a lot of farms up and down 441, right? You go to Clint Moore, right? And you turn right and you go up 441 towards the Wellington Mall, and you look on both sides of the road, and the farms are everywhere except for the ones that have been basically taken over by gigantic housing communities, right? Up and down through there. By the way, if you go up Lyons, north and south, you'll see a lot of signs that say, welcome to the Palm Beach County Agricultural Preserve. That land was supposed to be set aside for agriculture. It is changing, especially as you get up around the Delray Marketplace, where every time I try to take Mrs. Turner to a movie or a nice restaurant, I run into a lot of kids. Mr. Turner, is that you? And so that's an area where you had a lot of farms, but now a lot of housing developments. And of course, the land is cheap, which means the houses are big and they come with price tags of, 800,000 and up because the land is not all that pricey, right? It's not near the urban market area where the price of the land goes a lot higher. Think about bid rent theory. Okay, when I'm in the grocery store, how can I tell how my food has been grown? Well, I'll give you a chance. I'll pause and I'll let you read through this. The code number on the fruits and the vegetables tells you, is it GMO? Has it been used with pesticides and chemicals and fertilizers? Is it organic? Where did it come from? They have to tell you the origin, right? It has to have a country of origin on there, right? So check that out the next time you're in the grocery store. Now, 2016, this was all the organic farms in the United States by state. Now, obviously, it's a choropleth map, so we have to change our scale of analysis. It's a national map, but the data is being shown by state, right? So the scale changes. We're comparing California to, say, Connecticut, okay? So which states have a lot? New York, Wisconsin, California. Okay. Now, remember when I told you that things go together in our class? What did we learn in the political unit about California, Wisconsin, New York? They tend to be more left voting. Look where the organic is not popular, in the Deep South, which tends to be right voting, right? The Mountain West and the Great Plains, again, those tend to be red states. They tend to be Republican. They tend to be conservative. The states that are up in New England in the Northeast, like Vermont, right? They tend to be liberal. They tend to be, Democratic voting. Washington State, right? Minnesota, Iowa. You could actually map out political voting patterns based on organic versus biotech farming, right? You're thinking like a geographer, right? Patterns and processes, okay? Now, remember, it's choropleth. So this doesn't mean that the whole state has organic. It doesn't mean that the whole state doesn't, right? You'll see Texas is shaded, Florida's shaded, and those states both voted Republican, right? But that doesn't mean that it's all Republican. And it doesn't mean that they're all organic. It doesn't mean that they're all non-organic, right? So you have to be able to change scale in your mind as you look at these images. Okay, let's talk about my friend Norman Borlaug. He's a very famous American that almost none of you have ever heard of. So Norman Borlaug was born in the United States to Norwegian parents. He went to school, went to college, and studied agricultural technology. He was working in Mexico on Green Revolution corn and wheat all over the world. He did work in India. He did work in Mexico. He did work in a lot of different parts of the world where he increased food yields. And he won the 1970 Nobel Peace Prize because they said that people that are hungry tend to have more conflict. So by feeding the world, he was improving the chances for peace. Now, he was out in the field when he found out that he won the Nobel Peace Prize. By the way, you win $1 million when you win the Nobel Prize. His wife drove out to the field in their, beat up old car. And she said, "Norman, you've won the Nobel Prize." And apparently, according to the story, he told her, "I'm busy." He got back to work and he didn't care a flip about winning the Nobel Prize. So if you go to Texas A&M University, Texas Agricultural and Mechanical University, Texas A&M, called the Aggies on their athletic teams. They missed out on the college football playoff, just barely, right? Probably should have made it in. Anyway, there's a building there that's named after him. And back at the beginning of our course, remember those faculty videos that I let you guys watch for extra credit? Your very first faculty lecture was a lady named Sarah Bednars. Sarah Bednars used to work with Norman Borlaug. Sadly, he passed away just a couple of years ago. But every day he would walk to campus at Texas A&M carrying his little briefcase and walking into a building that had his name on it. They named it the Norman Borlaug Center. And in that room, there's all these kids studying biotechnology and farming and all the, the green revolution type things, right? So Sarah Bednars, she retired just recently from Texas A&M University. She's professor emeritus now of Texas A&M. So a long time ago, they asked Norman Borlaug about organic food. And, if you can indulge me. I'll give you my impersonation of Norman Borlaug because I've seen the video where this quote comes from. This organic movement is ridiculous. For those who want to go the organic route, God bless them. Let them spend more money for their food. But looking at the world at large, this is an impossibility. Most of the people who are opposing biotechnology, they've never known hunger. These people say that the little farmer should permanently accept that he's going to stay on that 3-acre farm with a hoe and a machete. That's fine in utopia, but don't give the world the false idea that they can produce the food that's needed for 6 billion people. And he gave that quote back in like the 1990s, almost 2000. And that's when the world was hitting that 6 to 7 billion number. Guys, you realize we're almost at 8 billion people now, and we're still continuing to see a population increase. Now, we know that the growth is slowing down. We know that the growth is no longer really going to be there. It's the inevitable fill up of the adults. We don't have a large number of children in the world anymore. It's still 2 billion children every generation, right? So we're going to level off at about 10, right? But you can't grow food for 8 billion people, right, using the old traditional ways. You're going to have to accept some technology. Unless in utopia, you have a high enough income that you can go to the Whole Foods and you can spend your whole paycheck and you can buy the organic fruits and vegetables. That's great for you, right? Right? God bless you. Right? But anyway, Norman Borlaug, he was quite a character. And if you ever look up Norman Borlaug, you'll probably find this little interview. It's from a movie called Harvest of Fear, if you ever want to check that out. 65% of the world's hungry people, they only live in a few countries of the world. We have hungry people in the United States. We have hungry people in Palm Beach County. We have hungry people in Boca Raton. All right. They call it food insecurity. They don't know where their food's coming from. Remember, in this pandemic time, we have the school district of Palm Beach County that's been serving millions of meals to families in need right here in our own local community. But when we talk about global hunger, these are the countries that have the biggest issues. And again, it's not because of lack of food. It's because of poverty. And it's because of the poor distribution of the food, particularly in places that have conflict. Democratic Republic of Congo, a good example of that. Okay, let's talk real quick about the landscape patterns of rural settlements. There is a topic on this in our slideshow. So I will let you read through this because we are going to do this in class. We will talk about the rectangular survey. You saw that a bit in that picture I showed you with the cropped circles. Remember how everything was straight lines and everything was rectangles? Look at everything west of the Mississippi in the United States, and you see rectangles. Rectangles of states, rectangles of counties, rectangles of farms. That is because of the United States government. We passed what was known as the Homestead Act of 1862, and that created that rectilinear pattern of the Western United States. Now, east of the Mississippi, we really have 3 land division systems. There's one called meets and bounds, which is mostly up in New England. There's one that's called the Spanish gridded pattern. Every Spanish city in the Western Hemisphere. And if you ever go to Latin America, we went to Lima, Peru, for example, they're all laid out on a grid. Any of you guys that have immigrated to the United States from a Hispanic country, you're probably sitting there going, oh yeah, that's, my capital city in my country, Colombia, Peru, Mexico, Argentina, wherever. They all have gridded patterns if it's Spanish. If it's French, they have the long lots. And we'll see these. I'll show you some pictures. And I think there may be, I don't know if I remember to put pictures in the slideshow, but you're going to see it because there's a topic that we're going to do in class on this. Okay. Most villages are going to take one of these forms. And by the way, the French long lots would be like letter A. The clustered one would be the meets and bounds system that's more like New England. The gridded one obviously would be the Spanish one. We don't really see the US pattern of rectangles here, but the French long lots would be A, meets and bounds B, the Spanish system E. You do see walled and rounded villages in different parts of the world. Walled villages are very famous in Europe. When we took kids to Carcassonne in southern France, it's one of the most famous medieval cities in the world, or Mont Saint-Michel, one of these places. The walls that go around it, and the castle and the church in the middle, and all the peasants would farm around that, right? That's very common in Europe. The rounded villages, you see those mostly in China. And you'll go to old traditional villages in China where the village will be kind of like a community. Even in some of the urban parts of China, they would have the hutongs, where you have the little courtyard, common courtyard, and everybody lives around it. That rounded village, if you've seen the new Mulan, okay, not the old, classic cartoon Mulan, which by the way is way better. But the new Mulan, still a great movie. If I'd never seen the cartoon, I would have thought it was awesome, but I still like the original. But you see rounded villages like that in China. Okay, let's talk about other crops that are commercial. Dairy, right? Again, milk. If it can be delivered fresh, it's going to be milk. If the milk will spoil, they call that area the milk shed, then you got to change the milk to something else. Butter, cream, yogurt, obviously cheese, right? Because those things can last longer than can the milk. Okay, so I'll let you read through this, right? We can save a little bit of time about that. Remember, dairy was a big part of the von Thünen pattern that we saw a little earlier in the slideshow. Okay, you can read, and I'll catch you on the next slide. Okay, so when we think about dairying, it's not like the kind of dairying that happened. My mom grew up on a farm in Tennessee, right? She was born in 1943. And as a little girl, they had to do little farm chores, right? They had 7 kids, right? People used to have big families because they had the farm and the kids did the work. Nowadays, one person goes into the milking parlor. They lead the cows in. Every cow has like a little tag on its ear, so they know how much milk that cow has given in the week or in the month preceding. They hook up all these cows to these big hoses and machinery, and one person sits there at a laptop and hits a button, and all of a sudden, all the milk goes through the hose, and we get gallons and gallons and gallons of milk. And then the cows go back out and they eat, and they bring them in once a week or whatever, and they milk the cows. This is the modern day kind of milking process, right? It's big technology. It's not sitting on a wooden stool, and milking the cow into a little wooden bucket. Now, where's dairy going to be consumed? This is partly cultural too. Look at this. Look at Europe. They drink a lot of milk in Europe, but it's usually warm. I want my milk to be ice cold, preferably with Oreos. Look at South Asia and see, people say, oh, cows are sacred. Yeah, they don't eat the meat. They won't eat beef, but they will drink the milk. It's like a gift, right, from the cow to people. So dairy is big time consumed in India. North America, we're big milk consumers as well. Notice Africa is not a big milk drinker population. And if they do drink milk, it's usually goat milk rather than cow milk. Okay. And you see the Caribbean, not a lot of cows. If you see Southeast Asia, not a lot of milk there. Okay. It's really European population, right? And the European population that extends over to the Western Hemisphere, right? Those are your big milk producers and consumers. Now, again, look at the United States, look at India, right? The United States, by far, biggest milk production in the world, right? By one country. And when you look at this, milk has become just a big part of our diet. And, milk products as well, because, now we have milk in ice cream and milk in all kinds of dairy additives and things like that. But look at the rest of the world. That milk production falls way, way, way off, right? Now, truck farming, this is going to be fruits and vegetables. The actual verb truck meant to take the vegetables to the market, which is why the vehicle that we call a truck, that's what it was originally designed to do, right? You owned a farm, you had a truck, you loaded up the truck, you trucked the fruits and vegetables to the market, and then you sold it, okay? Obviously, this is a big part of von Thünen as well, because this would be in one of those interior rings close to the city because the fruits and vegetables would spoil. We see this a lot in the southeastern United States as well as in California. Remember, I told you that California is a big producer of fruits and veggies. If you're in the southeastern U.S., Florida is one of the big producers of fruits and vegetables. Peppers, tomatoes, strawberries, all kinds of things grown in Florida, especially Central Florida. If you want to get a little more local, I've mentioned several times, that's why I put 441 there, because you go up and down 441 into Broward County as well, and you'll see a lot of farms that are producing those kinds of, very, very fresh fruits and vegetables. Obviously, I mentioned peppers and I mentioned, strawberries and those kinds of things, but it could also be things like potatoes, right? Those are truck farmed as well. The two biggest states in the United States for potato crops, Maine in the northeastern United States, and especially Idaho. When you buy your Ida, right, that's Oregon, Idaho, most of those farms that work for that company are on the Oregon-Idaho border. And then we have the big problem. In America, we have a lot of places where poverty makes it so that people cannot get access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Mostly these are in urban areas, although food deserts can be in rural places too. But generally speaking, they're in urban neighborhoods where people don't have access to transportation, particularly they don't own their own car, and where grocery stores are more than a mile from their house. Imagine having to walk a mile and now add to it that you're carrying all of your food from the grocery store. Okay. If it's a perishable item, that's going to be a problem because to walk a mile is going to take you 20, 30 minutes or more, right? It's not like you guys get in your big urban assault vehicle and you run over to Whole Foods with your Yeti cooler in the back and you put all your expensive, cold items in there and you're, 47 miles an hour on your way back to your house. This is the poorest places in America. Oftentimes, it's heavily correlated to race. These are the areas of the United States where we have a concentration of Black populations in inner cities. There's a very famous food desert that exists where I used to go read AP exams every summer. Now, the last 2 years, this year and last year, we didn't go because of COVID. But if you leave my hotel and you walk outside in downtown Cincinnati, there is no grocery store within walkable distance of that area. Now, there is a Kroger that you go up 6th Avenue. By the way, Kroger World Headquarters is in downtown Cincinnati. There is an old Kroger supermarket there that is in the shadow of the corporate headquarters. But if you go in that grocery store, there's no fresh food. There's no produce section. There's no fresh meat. There's no fresh fruits and vegetables. Everything is in a box or a jar or a can. And what happens when we stick things in boxes and jars and cans, it's loaded with sugar, it's loaded with salt, it's loaded with preservatives, it's loaded with chemicals, which is why we see obesity is such a big problem in poor Black communities of inner cities. It's why diabetes is such a big rampant problem in poor Black communities in the United States. And I don't want to make it just poor Black and urban. It's also a problem in poor white and rural America as well. Okay. But these are called food deserts. Right. And they're places where the grocery store is just not there. Now, there was an essay question on the AP exam a couple of years ago, and almost nobody got credit for the first part of it because it said, what would you need as a geographer? What would you need to know to map the location of the food deserts? Okay. You would need two things on your GPS and GIS. Where are the people who need the food? And where are the locations of the grocery stores? Because if you make a map of the low income neighborhood and then you put a dot where all the grocery stores are, if those dots don't exist in that shaded neighborhood, you've got a food desert. Now, ironically, what always exists in a food desert? Things like McDonald's, because McDonald's is cheap food and it's fast food. It's not necessarily healthy food, right? And yet in these poorest communities, oftentimes fast food is super available. Healthy, fresh food is usually not available to them, and especially not at prices that they can afford. Because believe it or not, healthy food costs more. And so what are the consequences? That was in the essay. What are the consequences of a food desert? Unhealthy eating. Unhealthy food causes unhealthy people, right? Obesity, diabetes, all that. It affects education because the kid who doesn't get a great nutrition comes to school, takes all the hard tests, right? And the kids that come from wealth, have all the greatest, food, and their brains develop differently when they're, babies and little. This has all kinds of knock-on effects. Now, they wanted consequences, and every single kid was giving the negative consequences. And one positive consequence that we probably should think about is that in many urban cities in America, in many urban neighborhoods, right, you got to go below the city scale. We're not talking about Detroit. We're talking about neighborhoods in Detroit. There are people who are taking it upon themselves to band together with their neighbors, and they're taking old abandoned lots, right? Where people have just left, right? In these poor neighborhoods, and they're going to the city and saying, "Hey, this lot is vacant. Can we make a little vegetable garden here?" And the city's like, "Yeah, okay." So the neighbors will get together and they'll plant carrots and they'll plant kale and they'll plant, little things that they can grow, right? And the community will band together and they'll create fresh, whole, healthy food for the children of the neighborhood. That's a positive consequence of people solving problems together. And yet we really don't ever hear the good news story. We only hear the bad news story. Right? And this is happening in a lot of big cities in the United States where they're having these community supported agriculture programs. You can get involved in this, by the way, community supported agriculture. They'll sell shares. It's like a business. You can donate money, and then the money is going to be used to buy the things that they need, right? To buy water, to buy fertilizer, to buy pesticides and things so that they can grow these fruits and vegetables in the inner city neighborhoods, right? These empowerment areas. So here's the food desert phenomenon. And I want to show you two maps after this. Now, you could pick out cities, okay? And you could pick out, for example, urban places where there are food deserts. But I want you to concentrate on this area here in the Deep South, Appalachia, Kentucky, West Virginia, right? Very poor. And I want you to concentrate here on the four corners of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah. Okay. But especially down here in the Deep South. And now I want you to see what I want you to see on these next two images. Here's the highest percentages of Black Americans. See any correlation between the two? And then here's Native Americans. And come back and look at your food deserts again. They're almost identical, right? To the poorest, lowest income of the minority populations in the United States, Black Americans and Native Americans. Okay. This is something that, again, we can tackle this. This is not that hard to fix, right? Community supported agriculture is one way to do it, right? But also changing the education and changing the mindset, right? That, don't settle for the fast food, right? Increasingly, these neighborhoods are demanding that, they have access to fresh whole fruits and vegetables. They're doing things like entrepreneurs are getting trucks, right? Refrigerated trucks, like these almost like food trucks where you guys would go get like, Korean barbecue and like, elevated tacos and things like that. But what if you stocked that truck full of fruits and vegetables and drove through the poor neighborhood and let the food could come to them instead of them having to get to the food, right? There's lots of ways you can solve these problems. Food deserts in Chicago, we're changing scale now. Now we're going to zoom into an urban area. Look where the food deserts are on the left map. It's always in south side of Chicago. Look on the right side where the largest presence of Black Americans are in Chicago. It's on the south side, right? South side of Chicago, right? When we do the urban unit, I'm going to show you guys a video about the south side of Chicago and about the projects and about poverty and concentrated segregation in American urban history. Okay, grain farming in the United States. This is huge. I told you guys about corn, soybeans, wheat, right? Again, you can read the slide. I don't need to read this slide to you, right? You could pause, you could come back. But I want to get into the imagery, right? And I want to talk about especially what you see when you see these patterns. Now, increasingly, corn in the United States today is not always us eating it, although corn is one of those ingredients that's in everything you eat. And again, I challenge you, go to the supermarket, go to the store, look at every package, look at every product, and look at the corn ingredient. By the way, if it's an ingredient you can't spell or pronounce, look it up. It's probably corn derivative, okay? Maltodextrin, right? There they go again, in and out of the door, right? Maltodextrin is a corn product. High fructose corn syrup. Most products nowadays have gotten rid of the high fructose corn syrup because it's terrible for us. Again, it turns us into fatty boombalatties. So look at the United States, look at China, big corn production. Look at Latin America. Remember maize, okay? Look at Africa, not a lot of corn production, okay? Remember, Africa doesn't really have the wheat, the corn, the rice. They've got the millet and the sorghum and the cassava, and they've got the yams and sweet potatoes and peanuts and those kinds of things. Not a lot of wheat, corn, and rice. Now, I was mentioning that we don't eat all the corn anymore. Right? If you look, we don't export a lot of corn because corn is too big and heavy to export. What we do export a lot is rice. Rice is easy to transport. It's light until you add the water, and water is ubiquitous. You can find water everywhere. And rice is very nutrient dense, and rice is, very cheap. So when we export food aid, it's not usually corn. Look at the red one there. Woo, just goes up. That's ethanol production. Nowadays, you go to the gas station, you pump gas in your car, 10% of that is now ethanol. We make that from corn in the United States. Brazil has converted all of their cars to ethanol, but they use sugarcane for theirs. Okay. If you look at feed and residual, the blue line, you see that's kind of coming down, right? And that's not just Americans eating it. We feed corn to animals, right? We feed corn to cows. Now, cows were not designed to eat corn. Cows were designed to eat grass. So if you go buy grass-fed beef, you're going to pay more. But if you want big, fat, juicy cows so that you can have cheap steaks, those cows probably ate corn. Okay. The number one use of corn in America is to feed animals. Okay. But ethanol is coming up, right? And of course, that's about a decade old. I'd love to find a new chart. I searched a little bit, but I'd love to find a new chart that, takes us out to say 2021. That'd be fun to see. Now, look at the ethanol production. There was an essay question on the AP exam, and they I would tell you, they probably use this map from the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture. They do an agricultural census all the time. So the shaded area is more corn. The states that start with the letter I, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, okay? Nebraska's big. What's their football team? Oh, wait, the Corn Huskers. So this is corn, right? And every dot is an ethanol plant. So when you see the ethanol plant locations, you're going to see the corn. Now, fun fact, when we get to Unit 7 and we talk about industry and bulk gaining and bulk reducing, you're going to see Spatial Shark on AP Daily, and I'm going to talk about ethanol production. And this is one of the videos that I did for AP Daily. And you're going to see, I don't know if it's the same map, but it was very, very similar to what we did, right? But the ethanol production is right on top of the corn, okay? Now, how do we know, about corn production? Obviously the government gives us a lot of statistics, and this is an example of a corn production, right? You got the big combine harvester there. Those tractors nowadays, they cost like $1 million. They're like a fighter jet inside there. The farmer sits in this big cockpit. He's got a joystick. It's like playing a video game. He's got a laptop, and now they have drones that fly up above. And the drones take pictures to see, where do I need more water? Where do I need more fertilizer? It's unbelievable, the technology now that goes into this farming. Now, what about wheat? There's one of my other cereal crops, right? Wheat, corn, and rice. So wheat is pretty much all over the world. But again, notice Africa doesn't have a whole lot of wheat. Some countries do, particularly in North Africa. Notice even Latin America is not really big on wheat. Except, Argentina is the big one. And by the way, Argentina has a big tradition of the wheat farming, also cattle ranching. Okay. Brazil too. If you've ever been to Rodizio, man, I got my thing on green all night long, right? You flip it over green, red, don't feed me anymore. Green, keep it coming, right? So if you look in the United States and Canada, we have a lot of wheat production. Right. And we certainly have wheat out there in Montana, Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, Colorado, a lot of wheat farming out there. Excuse me. And then, of course, you see the other places in the world. Europe is big on wheat as well. Now, in the United States, I just mentioned Montana, Idaho, the Dakotas, Kansas especially. The plains of Texas, a lot of wheat farming out there too. And again, these are bushels. By the way, a bushel is 8 gallons, right? That's how big a bushel is. So we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not millions of bushels. And these are look, where's our data analysis here? What scale are we working at? It's a national map. We've got state borders, but we're looking at this data by county, county by county, by county, by county, by county. And we're talking millions of bushels of corn or wheat or rice or soybeans, or when you go to this USDA website, you can see all these cool maps. Now, these are the combine harvesters for wheat. Okay. Now, we saw the corn one, and now you see the wheat one. And oftentimes these are private companies that the farmer won't buy, 5 tractors, right? But there's a company that will go around the country and they'll say to the farmer, hey, we'll come in and cut down your wheat for you. And this is after they've harvested it, right? They're just mowing it down. We know they're not harvesting because there's no trucks collecting anything, right? You see the tubes. Whereas we go back to the corn, right? We're pouring that corn into that hopper that's on the other little tractor there, right? That's how we know the difference. Here, we're just cutting it down. Now, how do we know if it's corn or wheat? There was an essay question a couple of years ago where they asked the kids, identify the crop in the picture. And the kids, they couldn't tell. They were like, well, I don't know. It was a picture. It was from above. I couldn't tell how tall it was. Corn is about as tall as a person. That's why they have corn mazes out in the Midwest during Halloween, where you go out there and you get lost in the corn, right? And then we have horror movies about that. Wheat is about maybe waist high. It's about 3 feet tall. And you walk through the wheat fields of grass and all that. Remember, all of these cereal crops used to be grasses that humans just domesticated over time, and we started eating it, right? But look at the implement on the front of the combine harvester. If it's that big wheel, that's wheat. If it's those pointy things, it's corn. You can always tell. Now, here was the funny thing about that. At the bottom of the picture on the AP exam, there was a credit of the photographer who took the picture. And I had a student who came up to me after the exam, a couple days after, and the kids, we could talk about the essays after the exam is released and all that. And the kids were arguing, was it corn or was it wheat? And they even had teen corn and teen wheat, and the kids were all arguing. And this one student came up to me and she said, Mr. Turner, those boys are so stupid. Those gifted freshman boys. They're arguing about wheat and corn. They didn't even notice that it said at the bottom of the picture what it was. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, well, look down there. It had Cotton Forrester or something. The guy's name was Cotton. So she literally wrote on her essay that the crop in the picture was neither wheat nor corn. It was cotton. By the way, look at the tractor. It will always tell you what the product is. Okay, livestock. Again, we're going to see this in the video I'm going to show you in class. So I'm not going to talk about this too much in the video. I'm going to save a little bit of time. In the United States, we eat a lot of meat. Beef is big, pork, chicken, not so much fish. You go to other countries in the world, they eat a much healthier diet than we do. For example, Japan, which is a very fish-based diet. That's why the Japanese live way longer than we do. It's why Americans are so much heavier. I saw a study one time that Americans are about 30 pounds heavier on average than other people in the world. Okay. Now, when I was in high school, I weighed about 150 pounds. When I got married, I weighed about 180 pounds. Currently, the new and improved model of Mr. Turner here is about 217 pounds. At least that's what it said this morning. But again, that's because we eat so much meat, right? And we'll talk about CAFOs. We'll talk about feedlots, where we concentrate and intensify the fattening of the animals. Okay. And I've got some pictures in here to show you. We don't do a lot of ranching anymore because, again, that takes up too much space and it's too much land and it's, not as efficient, right? The feedlots are a lot more efficient. But beef is not an efficient use of land anyway. It takes a lot of water. It takes a lot of grain. We have to feed these animals a lot of corn. And that's all to give us 1 10-ounce ribeye. I mean, that would be great. I'd take one right now if you'd offer it, right? Or maybe Chick-fil-A. Maybe I'll go to Chick-fil-A after this video, right? But look, you ever see the David statue? I've been lucky enough to go to Florence twice. And he looked the same both times. But if you look at the one on the left, that would be the David if it was in the United States, right? Because we're fatty boombalatties. That's what we are as Americans, right? We eat too much. We drink too much. We smoke too much. We're fatty boombalatties. Okay. Where are all the animal production in the world? Mostly in the richest countries, right? The poorest countries generally don't eat a lot of meat. That's very important to know, right? As a trend, the United States, biggest meat consumers in the world. This is an example of a feedlot. And increasingly what's happening is that residential suburban America is smacking up against these feedlots. Imagine what that smells like, right? Imagine, do you really want to live in that neighborhood where you've got, 1 million cows on the other side of the fence? But you see this in places like Colorado. You see this in places like Wyoming. You see this in places like Texas. If you go on Google Earth, there's a really cool place. If you want to look it up, it's called Hereford, Texas, Hereford. Zoom in on it, and you'll see not one, not two, not three, not 10. There's a bunch of feedlots all around Hereford, Texas. Tens of millions of heads of cattle right there. And the slaughterhouses are right there on the highway and the railways. And then they ship that meat back east where everybody lives. Okay, now pig production. China, pork, man. Pork production in China is huge, right? Notice the complete absence of pork in the Middle East and in the Muslim states of the world. Remember, Islam forbids the consumption of pork, just like our Jewish friends, right? The Muslims won't eat pork. That's why there's a complete absence of pork production in that part of the world, right? They might ask you questions like that. If it's beef production and consumption, you know that India will not show it because Hindus avoid the consumption of beef. That's why McDonald's in those parts of the world, they won't serve a beef patty in India. They will not serve pork products in the Middle East. Okay. When we took kids to Egypt on our cruise, we were on a cruise that went up and down the Nile, and there was no bacon, there was no sausage, there were no pork products of any kind, right, in those parts of the world. So when you go to Southeast Asia, a lot of pork. Obviously, in the United States, we're a big pork society, particularly the Deep South. A lot of your barbecue, your baby back ribs and those kinds of things, that's all pork production. And Europe, of course, is big pork production too. Okay. Every dot is 2,500 cows. Now, Hereford, Texas, that I told you about, is about right in here. Okay. But look again, all up and down these rectangular flyover states, the amount of beef cows that are out there. And look at the total, right? This is 28 million cows. Right. So when we look at that, that's a lot, but that's beef. You can get a lot of meat out of one cow. Let's talk about chickens. Look at the total: 9 billion chickens. Right? There's more chickens in the United States than there are people in the entire world. And look at the Deep South. Look at North Carolina. Oh, there's a huge chicken production here. If you go on Google Earth and you zoom in county by county, right? Remember I told you could go look at cows? You can actually find the chicken buildings. There are these long metallic buildings with like 1 million chickens in each building. And when you zoom in on Google Earth and you go into these rural areas of the Carolinas, North Georgia, Northwest Arkansas, by the way, any companies that you know of that deal with chicken, and I'm not just talking Chick-fil-A, and I'm not just talking about McDonald's with chicken nuggets, because Chick-fil-A has just exploded in the last 30 years. I'm talking Tyson and Purdue, the two big chicken companies in America. There was an essay that asked kids about the geographical distribution of the poultry production process in the United States. They wanted to know where and why there. The land in the South is cheap, right? It's rural, which is easy for these chicken houses, these millions of chickens in each house. And you're not going to find that in a big city. You're going to find that in a rural area, right? And it costs very little to transport them. But all the chickens have to be about the same size and shape. So all the chickens now, they're very scientifically controlled by Tyson and Purdue, the companies that deal with these chickens. Because when you take them to the restaurants, the fast food places, especially the KFCs and the Chick-fil-A's of the world, they need the chickens to all be pretty much the same standard size and weight, which is why when you go to the grocery store, they all look the same. You go buy like a fresh whole chicken or chicken legs or chicken breasts or chicken wings, and they're all the same. By the way, anybody know the biggest consumption of chicken in America? What day of the year? Super Bowl Sunday. A lot of chicken fingers, a lot of chicken nuggets, a lot of chicken wings on Super Bowl Sunday. Okay. It's not just chickens anymore. Poultry also includes turkey. And turkey's not just for Thanksgiving anymore, right? People eat turkey because it's healthy. And we've got turkey ground beef, and we got turkey spaghetti, and we got turkey tetrazzini, turkey lasagna, turkey sausage, right? And it's healthier because it's turkey. All right, your biggest turkey producing states, you got to start going up north, right? Chicken in the south, turkey more so up north. You ever see those maps? Where does your Thanksgiving turkey come from? Michigan's a big producer. Okay, plantation agriculture. So this is going to be, kids hear the word plantation, they think, oh, the United States before the Civil War. We're talking about coffee, tea, sugar, tobacco, rubber, vanilla, right? All of these are products today that are grown on plantation style farms. It is still cheap labor. It's not slave labor anymore, but it is close to slave labor because it's very, very low income. The average coffee farmer is making about a nickel out of the cup of coffee. You're going to tip the barista more than the farmer is going to make of the cup of coffee. But latitude is huge here, okay? Because latitude affects climate, right? When I change my line of latitude, if I go north or south, I'm getting colder. And if I go towards the middle of the earth, the equator, I'm getting warmer, hotter, and wetter. And don't forget, latitude affects all of this. So where's my coffee producing? It's got to be, fairly equatorial, but usually at elevation. So it's warm temperatures, but cooler in the evenings because I'm at altitude. Coffee originated in Ethiopia, right? That's the origins. That's what they call the Arabica bean because it's from the Arab part of the world. In the United States, we see a lot of it's not always Arabica coffee. Arabica coffee is usually a little more expensive. There's now a coffee that's a Robusta bean, which is more indigenous to Colombia. Colombian coffee is thought of as being super high quality, but the biggest producer of coffee in the world is Brazil. The second biggest producer of coffee in the world, I'll probably blow your mind away on this one, it's Vietnam. Right? Vietnamese coffee is not thought of as being the best quality coffee. But as Americans, when you go get coffee at the coffee shop, you probably don't know enough about where your coffee came from to be able to specify. And so when you say you want coffee, they're going to give you the cheapest bean they can give you, and they're going to sell you the most expensive coffee they can. Right? So they'll use mixed coffees and flavors. If you put French vanilla or hazelnut or pumpkin spice in your coffee, oh, they're laughing because they know they're going to give you the worst quality coffee, but they'll cover it up with a bunch of smells and tastes, and you'll never know that it's bad coffee. Now, if you drink perfectly black coffee and you don't put anything in it, right, you'll tell the taste right away. And there you're going to want the best quality coffees. Okay. So make sure it's the same with chocolate. It's the same with vanilla. It's the same with tea. It's the same with any of these products. Latitude's important. Labor costs are important. Big companies control it all. Right. And it's mostly poor countries exporting to rich countries. Okay. So here's how climate affects that. Right. Now, obviously, the driest is the deserts. Okay. And the kind of pink, purpley colors are the polar climates. Coffee cannot exist in either one of those two places. What you're going to see, it's all based on not just temperature, but also precipitation. This is a climograph. You've probably seen that in science class before. But when you think about where coffee exists, right, it's all going to be based on the countries are formerly colonized countries, right? And again, they're like Colombia, Brazil, Ethiopia. We mentioned Vietnam. They're all kind of in those middle latitudes from 0 to 20, right? That's where the coffee is going to be. Okay, let's talk about cotton. We use cotton, of course, a lot in clothing. Egypt is world famous for the best quality of cotton. India is also a big cotton producer. Most of your cotton clothing, if you see your t-shirt, you look at your tag in the back, you're going to see that it's not American cotton anymore. A lot of times it's from Africa or Asia, right? And it's going to be made, particularly Bangladesh is a big maker of cotton garments that have been grown in the cotton is actually produced in, say, India or some country nearby. And then they move the cotton to the factory and they take advantage of really low wage, cheap labor, oftentimes like sweatshop type labor. And then they make the cotton clothing there. Now, historically, the Confederacy was big into cotton. They thought the British would support them because of that. The British found out that they could get cotton from Egypt and India, and it was free because the British owned Egypt and India, and they didn't have to pay for Southern cotton. And that's an important part that came out of the Civil War. Rubber. Now, again, people think of rubber. They don't think it's as big of a consumer product as it is. Your car only touches the ground in 4 places. Those 4 places are made out of rubber. Rubber is used in sound. It doesn't conduct electricity, so it's used a lot in electrical components. It's used in housing construction. It's used in the medical profession, right? The latex gloves. Nowadays, a lot of it is man-made, But the traditional original rubber, it comes from a rubber tree or a rubber plant. And it's not from the leaves, which are very waxy. It's from the actual bark. It's almost like a maple syrup kind of thing, except instead of drilling a hole and it drips out the spout, they will etch into the side of the tree. I'll show you a picture here. And they'll have these little pots that collect the liquid rubber. And then, of course, it has to be cooked, right? Or it has to be brought to temperature. The man who invented that process, you might recognize his name. His name was Charles Goodyear. Anything about Goodyear that has to do with rubber? But that's called vulcanization, when they cook the rubber to make it, like what we would put in tires, or, the bottom of your Air Force Ones or whatever, right? When you think about natural rubber, it's now being grown mostly in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, here in Malaysia. But you can also see rubber in Brazil and other places in equatorial West Africa. Okay. Luxury crops, these are going to be things, again, coffee, tea, plantation agriculture. Okay. Vanilla is one that has been very popular lately. The price of vanilla has really skyrocketed, Madagascar being the biggest producer. Most of the time, these farms are fairly small, but again, it's going to be plantation style labor. So very, very, very cheap labor, oftentimes women. But again, this is changing, right, in the modern world. You can read about coffee, you can read about tea there, you can read about chocolate there. And these are fun things that you can search online. There's all kinds of great YouTube videos that show you how coffee is made and how tea is made and how chocolate is made. If you've ever been to Pennsylvania, go to Hershey Park. They have a great video that tells you how they get their chocolate. Most Hershey chocolate comes from the Western Hemisphere. Most European chocolate companies, Nestle being the biggest one, get their chocolate from West Africa. The number one chocolate grower, cacao is the product, is Cote d'Ivoire. Right, that's the biggest producer, and a countries next door, Ghana. I showed you the Nutella map, right? In Nigeria was a big producer. So, but Cote d'Ivoire is the biggest cacao producer in the world. This is coffee, right? And the ladies here are picking out the beans that are not good. Again, lots of female labor. This is a tea plantation. When I went to Malaysia, we went to a place called the Cameron Highlands, which is the biggest tea producing part of Malaysia. It's up at altitude, very high altitude. And the tea leaves are, of course, packaged and then sent all over the world. The British are, of course, big tea consumers. The Americans, not so much after the Revolutionary War, because we dumped all the tea in the harbor. That's why Americans drink coffee, by the way. We're 4% of the world, but we drink 50% of the coffee. Imagine that. But increasingly, tea has become sexy and exciting again. And you're starting to see things like Teavana and those kinds of things where tea has become an alternative to coffee, right? And this is cacao. This is chocolate. And again, it comes in a big pod, right? And in this case, these are men. They'll use their machete and they'll slice open the pod and break it. And then inside will be the cacao, the actual beans, which are the seeds inside the coffee. They grow on those small trees in the background, and there'll be a couple of dozen pods or whatever on each tree. And a lot of this work is done by hand. And then, of course, it's shipped off to the factory so that they can turn it into the chocolate that you and I love, right? Number one time of the year for chocolate coming up, Valentine's Day. The United States will spend tens of billions of dollars on Valentine's, and a big part of that will be chocolate. Here's your, I probably should have put this slide after the coffee slide, but here's your places that are big coffee producers. And this data is a little bit old. I told you Brazil's number one. That is true. I had said that Vietnam is two. It is two now. This map is a little bit old. They still show Colombia two, and they show Vietnam being four, but it is now the second biggest producer in the world. This is what they call the coffee belt. Now, again, there was an essay, and they asked kids, what do the coffee producing countries share in common? Well, they're all in the middle latitudes. They were all colonized. None of these are colonizers, okay? And then they wanted to know, what is the advantage of being a coffee producing country? Well, they can make money. What's the disadvantage? If you're the grower of the coffee, you don't control the market. Who controls the market? The people buying the coffee, the people producing the coffee, the manufacturers and the roasters, right? There's four big gigantic companies that roast all the beans. Coffee doesn't get shipped already roasted. They ship it as a green bean, right? Not green beans, but, and then the coffee gets to, say, Seattle, where, Starbucks is going to roast it, right? And they ship it fresh and green, and then they'll roast it right there in the store, right? You can buy the bags of coffee, right? Which are, really nice if you've got your Nespresso machine at home or your own little roaster, right? You can actually roast your own beans at home. But most Americans nowadays, we're buying the instant coffee, or we're buying the little K cups, right? That was the big thing just a couple of years ago with the Keurig machines, right? Now, when you think about the money in coffee, look what the grower gets. Almost nothing. The companies that control it are making all the money. Okay. And now here's how you can change that. There is what they call fair trade. Fair trade doesn't just exist in coffee. You can get fair trade chocolate. You can get fair trade tea. You can get fair trade, lots of different products. It's a socially conscious kind of a business where big NGOs, non-governmental organizations, have gotten involved as the middleman, and they will divert more money to the farmer to build schools, to build health clinics, to give the farmer a little better income, right? The result is, of course, you have to be willing to pay more. One of the most famous ones of these fair trade coffees, this one happens to be Starbucks. If you go into Starbucks and ask for fair trade, you'll get it. They won't necessarily offer it to you. You kind of have to know what you're looking for. But again, if you go to Trader Joe's, you go to Whole Foods, some of these places, you can look for coffee. There's one that's called irrigation, right? And don't ask me to spell that for you, but it starts with a Y. And it's from Ethiopia. And it's a single origin coffee. You're going to pay more, but it is some of the best coffee in the world. Okay. Irrigation, right? Of course, Colombia famous for quality as well. But again, different bean. If you're coming from, the Middle East, you're going to get an Arabica bean. And if you're coming from the Western Hemisphere, you're going to get the Robusta bean, right? Café Colombiana. Mediterranean agriculture, obviously grapes are very famous here, making wine, but olives for olive oil, citrus fruits, and those kinds of things. Almonds are also considered Mediterranean. Again, a narrow latitude here, 30 to 40 degrees of latitude. If you go north of that, it's too cold. If you go south of that, it's too hot. There's actually a book that Mrs. Turner got me for Christmas. It's called The Geography of Wine. If your parents are anything like me, maybe they've got the refrigerator with 50, 60 different bottles from all over the world, right? Wine tastes different from different parts of the world. And that's what we call terroir, right? It's all about the dirt. It's all about the land that it's grown on. And the smells and the flavors will be different from different parts of the world. When you get old enough, 21 or higher, and you go to college, you can take maybe a wine tasting class in college. They actually have those as electives, right? It's a lot of fun. When you think about the appellation, right? Not the Appalachian Mountains. The appellation is, where does the grape come from? In the United States, if it says Napa, you're going to pay more. If you go to some place like Paso Robles, it's going to be a lot cheaper, right? Even though the quality might still be very, very good. If you get it from Oregon or Washington State, it's going to be even cheaper, right? But again, Napa is that, it's that quality. It's kind of like Bordeaux, right, in France, right? And also, other than Europe and the United States, go south of the equator, Chile, Argentina, especially Mendoza in Argentina is world famous now. South Africa, Southeastern Australia, New Zealand, because they get the same climate. They're 40 degrees south of the equator, just like California and Italy and France and Spain are 40 degrees north of the equator. Okay. Of course, the origin goes back even older than that. You can find the origin of winemaking in places like ancient Persia, right, which is today Iran. You can find winemaking, obviously, in Greece. You can find winemaking in Turkey and also in Bulgaria and places like that. Now, in today's modern Muslim world, where alcohol is, forbidden, the consumption of alcohol is against the Quran, you won't see the wine production. You won't see the wine consumption that you used to see in ancient times, right? Most of that wine consumption has shifted with Christianity Don't forget, this is the body of Christ. This is the blood of Christ, right? So wherever you see Christianity, you're going to see grapes and you're going to see wine. There's a heavy correlation there. If you ever get a question about that, think about the geographical patterns and then think about the processes. So here's your wine production map. Now, again, we should clarify and specify, right? Because we're talking wine production. We're not necessarily saying only from grapes, because you can make wine from a lot of different fruits. So you look at China there and you say, what? Chinese wine? Never heard of China as a wine producer. The Chinese love wine, especially nowadays, the new rich Chinese, they're buying up California wine like there's no tomorrow, right? But there is wine production in China. It's just not the same quality grape wine. They're using other fruits. And you can make, for example, palm wine, which is coming from the date palm. And you can make wine out of other fruits as well, besides just from grapes, right? But notice the latitude, right? Literally, here's the Mediterranean here. Go east and west. And then at about 40 degrees, come down here and look, we've got, Australia, South Africa, Argentina, Chile, right, and so on. Okay, so there's your wine production map. Okay, this happens to be Napa Valley in California. This is a vineyard where wine is being grown. Lots of migrant workers, right? Lots of labor that's seasonal labor. They move around because they don't need to be there all year long. They just need to be there during the crush or the harvest time. And nowadays this has become a big touristy thing too, right? To go to California to see this. Very little mechanization. You can see one tractor there, but a lot of this is still done by hand, right? Where they do the pruning and they take the leaves off and all that, okay? Now, finally, the last thing we're going to talk about with agriculture is illegal drugs. I would like to clarify that this is illegal drugs. And of course, it's very difficult to spatially map production here because they're not exactly going to say to the government, hey, we're over here making, the illegal drugs. If you're in the Eastern Hemisphere, this is mostly poppy seed production, which is where heroin is derived from. If you're in the Western Hemisphere, it's mostly coca leaves, which is the derivative, where cocaine comes from. Yes, people will say, hey, did Coca-Cola used to have cocaine? It wasn't like it was a tremendous amount, but Coca-Cola came from the coca leaf, right? When we took kids to Peru, and you're at 14,000 feet, and you get sick and nauseous and you're throwing up, right? The Inca people would chew the coca leaves. So they had little candies that they gave the kids that were like, not like a lollipop, but more like a little butterscotch candy. And if you would just kind of let it melt in your mouth and kind of like, suck on it, it would soothe your stomach, right? Because the coca would settle down. All of these were medicinal plants that people have turned into narcotic forms and have abused, right, in modern day. And poppy seeds, people will say, oh, if you eat poppy seeds, you're going to register positive on a drug test. You'd have to eat like 600 poppy seed bagels for that to happen. But poppy seeds are the origin of heroin. And remember, we had the opium wars in China in the 1800s, where the British fought the Chinese for control of places like Hong Kong. So drugs have always been a big part of agriculture. And what's really sad is that it's often the poorest countries that are growing the drugs that are being consumed by people in the richest economies of the world, right? And oftentimes they have to make a hard choice. Do I grow food for my family or do I grow drugs for export? And it's always controlled by the cartels and the gangs, right? So when you're buying drugs, you're actually funding the activities of the drug gangs, the narco terrorists, the gun runners, and the criminal activities of the underworld, which is where this drug production is being done, and especially the transportation of the drugs through Central America, Mexico especially, but also through the Caribbean, right? And of course, Miami, you remember Miami Vice, the big show of the 80s. Goodness gracious, they're scaring me now with the door. If it's not Chanel barking, it's the door to the garage. But when you think about these places, Miami, of course, has a big connection into the drug trade. Obviously, New York, Los Angeles, up through Texas, Houston, Dallas, right? Especially cities along the border in Texas have a big issue with the drug trade. Okay, so that's going to do it for me on this video. I hope that you will find time to chunk this into smaller digestible bites. And until then, I will wish you guys to stay healthy, help your parents, and I'll see you guys in class. Thanks for watching.